Margaux Sinclair had just been laughed out of her billionaire father's will, reading with one tarnished 1922 peace dollar when she noticed a seam around its edge. His widow and the other heirs had received the visible fortune. Margaux, his estranged daughter, had received $1. She was still gripping the coin beside the elevator when attorney Soren Abernathy caught up with her. He told her the humiliation in that boardroom had been deliberate. The will was only what Hollis Belmont wanted the family to see. Inside the descending elevator, Abernathy handed Margaux a black sealed envelope her father had left for her. The letter did not sound like the man who had spent years pushing her away. For the first time, Margaux had physical proof that his rejection might have hidden something else. Then the letter directed her back to the coin. Under the elevator's fluorescent light, she turned the old silver dollar between her fingers. The seam opened. Inside were a tiny memory card and a small magnetic key. The $1 insult had just become a lockbox, and that answered the first question. Hollis had never intended the coin to be worthless, but it created a larger one. What had he hidden behind it? When the elevator reached the underground garage, Abernathy gave her part of the answer. Before his death, Hollis had transferred an off-grid property and hidden assets directly to Margaux. The family upstairs did not know. Margaux looked at the open coin in her palm, then at the black Lexus waiting nearby. Minutes earlier, she had believed her father's final act was rejection. Now the rejection looked like camouflage. The dollar was not her inheritance. It was the first key to it. Margaux closed her fingers around the magnetic key. Somewhere beyond Manhattan, it opened something Hollis had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide from his own family. And Margaux still did not know why he had trusted only her to find it. When the billionaire patriarch died, his favored children inherited the skyscrapers, the super yachts, and the offshore accounts. His estranged daughter received a single tarnished coin, handed to her in a room full of mocking relatives. But that coin was the literal key to an untouchable empire, and the people laughing at her had no idea they had just inherited their own destruction. Silence fell over the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Whitman, Pierce, and Abernathy, one of Manhattan's most ruthless estate law firms. The air was suffocating, thick with the scent of expensive cologne, leather bindings, and unadulterated greed. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the relentless downpour of a bleak November afternoon washed over the financial district, streaking the glass in jagged silver lines that mirrored the desolate hollow in Margaux Sinclair's chest. Margaux sat at the far edge of the 20-foot conference table, looking entirely out of place. While the rest of the family wore bespoke Italian morning suits and black silk designer dresses, Margaux wore a sensible, slightly worn navy blue blazer over her hospital scrubs. She had come directly from a grueling 14-hour shift in the emergency room at Bellevue Hospital. Her hands still carried the faint antiseptic smell of surgical gloves. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a functional ponytail, and there were circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. She had not come for money. She had come hoping for closure, for a final word, perhaps even a posthumous apology, from a man who had been a titan to the world, but a ghost of a father to her. That man was Hollis Belmont, the fiercely private and notoriously cutthroat founder of Belmont Global Logistics, an empire worth an estimated $4 billion. Hollis had been dead for 9 days, but his presence still seemed to saturate every molecule of this suffocating room. Across the table sat Margaux's stepmother, Odette. Odette was 20 years Hollis's junior, dripping in diamonds and a mourning veil that barely concealed her triumphant smirk. Her posture was impeccable. Her fingernails were freshly lacquered in dark burgundy. She looked less like a grieving widow and more like a woman who had just won a very long, very expensive game of chess. Flanking Odette were Margaux's half-siblings, Thatcher Belmont, Odette's son from a previous marriage, whom Hollis had formally adopted, was a notoriously lazy socialite who had spent more time wrecking Aston Martins on the Montauk Highway than attending board meetings. He sat with one ankle crossed over his knee, scrolling through his phone with the bored detachment of a man who already knew the score. Beside him was Lizette, whose life's greatest achievement was marrying and divorcing a minor European royal in the span of 11 months. She adjusted her black Prada shawl and dabbed at perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Soren Abernathy, the senior partner and Hollis's most trusted legal confidant for 4 decades, sat at the head of the table. He was a man carved from granite. His expression was unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. A heavy gold watch chain disappeared into his vest pocket, and his hands were folded over a thick leather folio with a stillness that bordered on eerie. He cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, like a cracking whip, and it broke the silence instantly. "We are here for the final reading of the last will and testament of Hollis Winston Belmont," Abernathy announced. His deep voice carried a solemn weight that pressed against the walls. Mr. Belmont was explicit in his instruction. There will be no interruptions. Margaux dug her fingernails into her palms beneath the table. She stared down at the polished wood grain, tracing the dark swirls with her eyes. She braced herself for what she already suspected would be a very public confirmation of her irrelevance. Abernathy began the agonizing process of dismantling an empire. The assets were staggering. To Odette, Hollis left the sprawling penthouse on the Upper East Side, the villa on Lake Como, and a controlling 60% stake in the primary logistics holding company. Odette's eyes glittered as the words washed over her. She placed one manicured hand flat on the table, a queen surveying her newly conquered territory. Thatcher was handed the keys to the private aviation fleet, a $50 million trust fund, and the commercial real estate portfolio in London. He did not look up from his phone, but a slow, satisfied grin spread across his face. Lisette was awarded the family's art collection, heavily populated with original Monets and Rothkos, along with her own exorbitant cash trusts. She let out a small, breathy gasp, then quickly composed herself, pressing her handkerchief to her lips as though the sheer volume of wealth was causing her physical distress. Millions, billions, sliced up and handed out like party favors at one of Odette's legendary fundraising galas. Margaux felt nothing but a dull, rhythmic ache behind her eyes. She had not expected a windfall. 10 years ago, when her mother, Hollis's first wife, had died of ovarian cancer, the fracture in the Belmont family had become permanent. Odette had moved into the penthouse within 4 months of the funeral. Within 8 months, she and Hollis were married. Within a year, Margaux had been effectively erased from the family portrait. Margaux had refused to play the sycophant. She refused to smile at Odette's dinner parties, refused to pretend that her mother's memory had not been steamrolled by imported Italian marble and a new woman's perfume in every room. She refused to beg for her father's attention. Instead, she had put herself through nursing school on student loans, working double shifts at a diner in Astoria to cover rent while studying pharmacology and trauma protocols until her vision blurred. Hollis had called her stubborn and foolish. Those were the last words he ever spoke to her directly. 5 years ago, through the intercom of his penthouse lobby, because the doorman had been instructed not to let her upstairs. She had not always been estranged. There had been a time, brief and fragile, when the fracture might have healed. Margaux was 17 when her mother died. She remembered the hospital room with a clarity that time had never managed to soften. The machines, the fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic that would later become the wallpaper of her professional life. Her mother's hand, thin as paper, wrapped around hers. And the folk song, the one about the mockingbird, hummed so quietly that the nurses in the hallway could not hear it. Her mother had sung it during chemotherapy too, a private ritual of defiance against the tubes and the chemicals, and the slow, systematic dismantling of a body that had once been strong enough to carry a child up 3 flights of stairs without breaking stride. Hollis had been at the hospital every day. He sat in the corner of the room in a straight-back chair, his suit jacket folded over his arm, watching his first wife die with a stillness that Margaux had mistaken for indifference. She did not understand then that some men grieve by turning to stone, that the stillness was not absence but an effort to keep from shattering in front of the 2 people he loved most dead. After the funeral, Hollis had disappeared into his work. The penthouse became a mausoleum. Margaux wandered the empty rooms, eating cereal for dinner, doing her homework at the kitchen island, where her mother had once made Sunday pancakes. She waited for her father to come home, to sit beside her, to say something. Anything. He came home at midnight most nights. He did not sit beside her. He poured scotch and stood at the window, staring at the skyline as though searching for something in the glass and steel that he could not find in his own home. 4 months after the funeral, Odette appeared. She arrived at a charity gala on the arm of a mutual acquaintance, and within 2 weeks she was having dinner at the penthouse. Within 6 weeks, her perfume was in the master bathroom. Within 8 months, she was Mrs. Hollis Belmont. Margaux confronted her father on the day the engagement was announced. She found him in his study, the room that still smelled faintly of her mother's hand cream because Hollis had not allowed anyone to clean the leather armchair where she used to read. "How can you do this?" Margaux had asked, standing in the doorway, her voice shaking with a rage that was too large for her 17-year-old body to contain. "Mom has been dead for 8 months. 8 months. And you are marrying someone who looks at this apartment like she is calculating the square footage." Hollis had not turned from his desk. His shoulders tightened. When he spoke, his voice was flat, controlled, and utterly impenetrable. "You do not understand the things I have to protect, Margaux. You are a child. You see what is in front of you. I have to see what is coming. Then tell me what is coming. Make me understand." He turned then, and in his face, Margaux saw something she would spend the next 10 years trying to decode. It was not anger. It was not impatience. It was fear. Raw, genuine, barely contained fear. The kind of fear that a man like Hollis Belmont should never have shown, because men like Hollis Belmont were not supposed to be afraid of anything. He opened the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a coin, an old, tarnished silver dollar. He held it out to her. "Take this," he said. "Keep it. One day you will understand the value of what I am giving you." Margaux looked at the coin. She looked at her father's outstretched hand, and she felt something break inside her, not with a crack, but with a slow, quiet tearing, like fabric pulled apart along the grain. "I do not want your coin," she said. "I want my father." She turned and walked out. She did not take the coin. She went to her room, packed a bag, and moved in with a friend's family in Astoria the following week. She applied for student loans, enrolled in a nursing program, and began the process of building a life that did not include Hollis Belmont or anything he represented. They spoke fewer than a dozen times over the next decade. Each conversation was shorter and colder than the last. The final one, 5 years ago, was conducted through the penthouse intercom because the doorman had orders not to let her upstairs. She had not known, standing in that study at 17, that the fear in her father's eyes was real. She had not known that the coin was the beginning of a plan that would take him a decade to complete. She had not known that the silence that followed was not cruelty but camouflage, a father forcing himself to become invisible to his daughter because visibility would have made her a target. She knew now, and the knowledge was worse than the silence, because it meant that every night she had spent believing she was forgotten, he had been thinking of her, building for her, dying for her. The coin she had refused at 17 was the same coin she now held in her hand at 28. He had kept it. He had waited, and when the time came, he had placed it in a dead man's will, knowing that the daughter who had once thrown it back at him would be strong enough now to pick it up. And finally, Abernathy said. He turned a crisp parchment page. The subtle shift in his tone caused the room to go entirely still. Even Thatcher looked up from his phone. Lizette lowered her handkerchief. Odette leaned forward almost imperceptibly, her dark eyes locked on the lawyer. "To my eldest daughter, Margaux Elise Sinclair Abernathy," read. His eyes briefly met Margaux's before darting back to the page. For her unwavering independence, her refusal to bow to expectation, and her insistence on making her own way in the world, I leave the sum of exactly $1. May it serve as a reminder of the value of hard work. A heavy, stunned silence dropped over the room like a lead curtain. Then Thatcher snorted. A sharp, cruel burst of laughter that he did not even attempt to contain. He slapped his palm on the table and shook his head. Lizette hid her giggles behind her manicured hand, leaning into her brother's shoulder. Her eyes darted to Margaux, savoring the reaction. Odette did not laugh. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her perfectly painted lips curling into a smile of pure venomous satisfaction. It was the look of a woman who had spent a decade engineering this exact moment. It was the ultimate legally binding humiliation. Hollis Belmont, a man who tipped valets $100, had mathematically reduced his firstborn daughter to a single, meaningless digit. Abernathy reached into his suit pocket. He did not pull out a check. Instead, he withdrew a heavy, tarnished silver coin and slid it across the long mahogany table. It spun slowly, the metallic scraping echoing against the polished wood before coming to a dead stop directly in front of Margaux's. It was an old, heavy 1922 piece dollar. The surface was dark with age, the relief of Lady Liberty worn smooth in places. The eagle on the reverse side stared up at the ceiling with a fierceness that felt almost mocking. "That concludes the reading," Abernathy said softly. Margaux stared at the coin, her vision blurred. Hot tears welled up despite her desperate, furious attempts to hold them back. It was not the absence of money that broke her. She had never wanted his money. It was the sheer cruelty of the gesture. He had summoned her here, exhausted and grieving, still wearing the scrubs she had worn, while restarting a stranger's heart at 3 in the morning, just to publicly slap her in the face from beyond the grave. He wanted her to be the punchline of Odette's dinner parties for the next decade. Well, Odette purred, adjusting her Cartier watch with deliberate, theatrical precision. "I suppose you can use it to take the subway back to Queens, dear." "Oh, wait. The fare went up, did it not? Such a shame." Thatch erupted into another fit of laughter. Lizette pressed her lips together, her shoulders shaking. Margaux did not snap back. She did not scream. She had spent 10 years learning to absorb cruelty the way Bellevue's walls absorbed the screams of the emergency room. Quietly, completely, without breaking. She picked up the heavy silver coin. Her hands were shaking violently, but her grip was firm. The cold metal bit into her skin. Without a single word, she stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound cutting through the laughter like a scalpel. She turned her back on the billionaires, walked past the oil paintings and the mahogany paneling, and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. If you have ever been the person who walked into a room knowing you did not belong there, if you have ever sat through a ceremony designed to remind you of your place, then you already know exactly what Margaux Sinclair felt in that corridor. Stay with her, because what happens next is the part nobody in that boardroom saw coming. Margaux practically ran down the corridor. The plush carpeting muffled her frantic footsteps. She hit the elevator button repeatedly with the heel of her palm, gasping for air as a panic attack threatened to close her throat. $1. A metallic token of his disdain. She pressed her forehead against the cool marble wall beside the elevator doors, finally letting a ragged sob escape her lips. "Miss Sinclair, Margaux, please, wait." Margaux jumped, spinning around. Soren Abernathy was striding quickly the hallway toward her, his long legs covering the distance in seconds. The stoic, unreadable lawyer from the boardroom was entirely gone. His tie was loosened, and he was looking over his shoulder, checking the empty corridor behind him with an uncharacteristic paranoia. "Leave me alone, Mr. Abernathy," Margaux choked out, furiously wiping her face with the back of her hand. "You did your job. The show is over. I have been properly humiliated for their entertainment. You did not stay for the final codicil," Abernathy said. His voice dropped to an urgent whisper as he stepped closer. "There is no codicil." "You said it concluded." "I said the reading was concluded," Abernathy corrected, his eyes intense behind the wire-rimmed glasses. "Because the rest was not for their ears." Hollis knew the boardroom was compromised. He knew Odette had people listening. He knew that if he left you anything of recognizable value on paper, her corporate attorneys would tie it up in probate litigation for 30 years until you were bankrupted by legal fees alone. Margaux froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The panic attack retreated, replaced by something sharper: confusion, suspicion, a dangerous, flickering ember of hope that she immediately tried to smother. "What are you talking about?" the elevator chimed. The doors slid open to reveal an empty car. Abernathy placed a firm hand on her shoulder and guided her inside. He hit the button for the underground parking garage, and as the doors sealed them in, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, black wax-sealed envelope. "Your father was a complicated man," Abernathy said. His tone softened in a way that unnerved her more than the urgency, but he was not a fool. Over the last 3 years, he realized that Odette and Thatcher were quietly embezzling from the logistics firm. Worse, they were altering documents, manipulating board votes, and slowly wresting control away from him. By the time he understood the full scope of what they were doing, he was too weak, both physically and legally, to stop them in the light of day. "Too weak," Margaux repeated. Her voice was flat. "My father was the most powerful man in any room he entered. He was never too weak for anything." "He was at the end," Abernathy said quietly. He met her eyes, and for the first time, Margaux saw genuine sorrow in the old lawyer's face. "He fought them in the dark, Margaux, because the light was no longer safe." Abernathy handed her the black envelope. "He told me, 'Give my daughter the dollar. If she throws it at my proxy in anger, she is not ready. If she takes it, even in her grief, she has the temperament to handle what comes next.'" Margaux looked down at the tarnished peace dollar still clutched in her left hand. The ridged edge was pressing a circular indentation to her palm. She had gripped it so tightly during her walk out of the boardroom that the metal had left a mark. She had taken it. She had not thrown it. She had not left it on the table. Even in the worst moment of humiliation she had ever endured, some instinct deeper than rage had told her to hold on. "Handle what?" she asked. "Open the envelope." "How do I know this is not another game?" Margaux said, and her voice hardened. "How do I know you are not one of them? He was your client for 40 years, Mr. Abernathy. You could be setting me up for anything." Abernathy studied her face for a long moment. The elevator hummed around them, descending. "Fair," he said. Then he said something that made the blood drain from Margaux's face. "Your mother used to sing to you when you had nightmares. A folk song about a mockingbird. She sang it in the hospital, too, during chemotherapy when she thought no one was listening. Your father told me about it once, late at night, after too much scotch. He said it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, and that losing it was what actually killed him. Everything after was just the body catching up." Margaux's jaw tightened. Her eyes burned. That detail had never been in any interview, any biography, any public record. Hollis Belmont did not discuss his first wife in public, ever. The only way Abernathy could know was if Hollis had told him in a moment of genuine, private vulnerability. She broke the wax seal. Inside was a single piece of heavy stationery, written in her father's unmistakable sharp angular handwriting. The ink was dark blue. The letters were precise, the hand of a man who had signed 10,000 contracts and never once let his pen waver. But here in places the lines trembled. He had been weakening. "Margaux, if you are reading this, I am dead, and I have just insulted you in front of the people who destroyed me. Forgive me. I had to make them believe they had won. I had to make them believe you were nothing to me, so they would never look your way. They have the company, Margaux. Let them have it. It is rotting from the inside with their debts and their fraud. But they do not have my legacy. Look at the coin, my brilliant girl. Look closely." Margaux frowned, holding up the heavy silver dollar under the harsh fluorescent light of the elevator. It looked completely normal. Lady Liberty on one side, the eagle on the reverse. But as she ran her thumb along the ridged edge, slowly, deliberately, with the practiced sensitivity of a nurse who could find a collapsed vein by touch alone, she felt it. A slight, inconsistent seam, running along the circumference of the coin, invisible to the eye, but unmistakable to trained fingertips. "Press the eagle's eye," Abernathy said quietly. Using her fingernail, Margaux pressed hard onto the tiny indentation of the eagle's eye on the reverse side. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a microscopic click, a sound so small it was more felt than heard. The entire top half of the coin shifted sideways. It was not a solid piece of silver at all. It was a hollow, masterfully crafted vessel, machined with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Tucked inside the shallow basin of the coin was a micro SD card no larger than her thumbnail and a tiny, uniquely cut magnetic key fobs of dark brushed steel. Margaux's breath hitched. The fluorescent light hummed. The elevator continued its slow descent. "What is this?" "The true inheritance," Abernathy said. The elevator shuddered to a stop. The doors opened onto the dim, echoing concrete of the underground parking garage. Odette thinks she has your father's wealth. She has his public wealth, the empire the world could see. For the last 10 years, Hollis has been quietly liquidating off book assets. Private mineral rights, untraceable bearer bonds, physical commodities that exist outside the banking system entirely. He converted them and moved them completely off the grid. Moved them where? Abernathy stepped out of the elevator and gestured toward a sleek, black, bulletproof Lexus idling in the dim garage, its engine purring softly. The exhaust curled in the cold underground air like cigarette smoke. To a property that does not exist on any county map. Purchased through 5 layers of shell corporations in my name, transferred to yours as of 9:30 this morning. You do not live in Queens anymore, Miss Sinclair. Margaux stood at the threshold of the elevator, one foot on concrete, one still inside the car. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Behind her, 47 floors above, Odette Belmont was probably already pouring champagne. Thatcher was probably calling his car dealer. Lizette was probably photographing herself, looking mournfully beautiful for social media. And here, in a cold parking garage that smelled like motor oil and damp concrete, a 70-year-old lawyer was telling her that her dead father had spent his final years building something in the dark, something meant only for her. If you have ever found a letter, a note, a message from someone you thought had forgotten you, and realized they had been thinking about you the entire time, then you understand the feeling that cracked Margaux Sinclair's chest open in that moment. Not joy, not relief. Something rawer, something that hurt more than the humiliation upstairs, because it meant that the silence had been a choice, and choices carry weight that indifference never does. She got into the car. The leather was cold against her back. Abernathy took the wheel with the ease of a man who had driven this route many times before. He pulled out of the parking garage, merged onto the wet Manhattan streets, and headed for the FDR Drive north. They drove in near silence for the first hour. The rain hammered the windshield. The wipers kept a metronomic rhythm. Manhattan's towers of glass and steel shrank in the rearview mirror and were swallowed by the November darkness. As they left the city behind and took the Taconic State Parkway north, the landscape changed. The suburban sprawl gave way to dense hardwood forests, stripped bare by autumn. The road narrowed. The streetlights disappeared. The world outside the windshield became a tunnel of black trees and silver rain. Margaux held the letter in her lap, reading it again by the glow of her phone screen. Each sentence detonated quietly inside her chest. I pushed you away after your mother died because I saw Odette for what she was. If she had known I loved you, you would have been a target. Your estrangement was your armor, Margaux. It was the only protection I could give you without them knowing. You did not know me as your father in those years, but I knew you. I watched you. I am so sorry. She turned the phone off. The car was dark except for the dashboard instruments. On the drive, Abernathy filled in pieces of the story. Not all of it. He was careful, dispensing information in measured doses, and Margaux could tell he was holding things back. But what he did share changed the shape of everything she thought she knew. Hollis had discovered the embezzlement 3 years before his death. Thatcher had been running personal expenses through subsidiary accounts. Odette had been funneling company assets into offshore vehicles she controlled. Together, they had drained tens of millions. But that was not what had broken Hollis. Corporate theft could be prosecuted. What had broken him was something Abernathy would not yet name. He told me you would understand when you saw the rest, Abernathy said, his eyes fixed on the dark road. He said there were things he could not put in a letter, things that needed to be shown. What things? You will see. There is a man in the town at the base of the mountain. Abernathy continued after a long pause. Fennel Wick, he is a machinist, 72 years old. He has maintained the property for the last 20 years. Your father trusted him absolutely, but he never told Fennel what was inside the lower levels. Fennel knows the mechanical systems, the gates, the locks. He built some of them. You will need him for what comes next. Why can you not just show me yourself? Because your father designed it that way, Abernathy said. He paused. No single person knows everything. Not even me, it was his insurance policy. If any one of us was compromised, the entire plan could not be unraveled from a single point of failure. The GPS on the dashboard blinked out somewhere past the Berkshire County line. Cell phone service had vanished 20 minutes earlier. Abernathy navigated entirely by memory, his turns confident and unhesitating, as though the route had been driven 100 times in darkness. He turned off the paved highway onto a hidden, heavily rutted dirt logging road. The Lexus lurched and groaned as the tires fought for traction in the mud. Branches scraped against the roof like skeletal fingers. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the ancient forest, illuminating nothing but wet bark and fog. After 3 miles of winding, treacherous terrain, the headlights struck something massive. Margaux leaned forward in her seat. A pair of towering wrought iron gates rose from the fog like the entrance to another century. They were at least 20 feet high, blackened with age wrapped in decades of dead, creeping ivy that had woven itself through every bar and hinge. The stone pillars on either side were covered in lichen. There was no mailbox, no address marker, just a rusted bronze nameplate welded to the left pillar, barely legible through the growth. The Haven. This property was built in 1910 by a reclusive industrial baron, Abernathy said, putting the car in park. The headlights glared against the iron gates, casting long distorted shadows into the forest behind them. Your father bought it 20 years ago. No one in the family knew, not even your mother. He pointed to a heavy, brutalist metal box mounted on the stone pillar next to the gate. It had no keypad, no keyhole, no screen. Just a thin horizontal slot cut into dark steel, the coin Margaux. She stepped out of the warm car into the freezing mountain air. The cold hit her lungs like a slap. Fog curled around her ankles and threaded through the iron bars of the gate. The only sound was the wind moving through the pine trees, a low, constant moan that made the forest feel alive and watchful. She walked up to the pillar. The metal box was ice cold under her fingers. She held up the magnetic key fob she had extracted from the hollowed-out piece dollar. It was small, dark, precisely machined. She slid it into the slot. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then, deep within the stone pillar, something engaged. Heavy mechanical gears began to grind. A low, industrial clanking echoed through the forest, reverberating off the tree trunks, sounding like a bank vault unsealing after decades of dormancy. The ground beneath her boots vibrated faintly. Slowly, groaning against the weight of time and corrosion and ivy, the massive iron gates began to swing inward. The dead vines tore and snapped as the bars parted, pulling the overgrowth apart like a curtain being drawn back from a stage. Abernathy pulled the car forward. Its headlights pierced through the widening gap. As the fog parted and the beam of light swept across the property beyond, Margaux Sinclair saw what her father had built in the dark, and the tarnished silver coins slipped from her fingers onto the dirt road. A winding driveway lined with centuries-old weeping willows stretched into the fog. The branches hung low, dragging against the roof of the Lexus, as Abernathy drove slowly forward. When the trees finally broke and the driveway opened into a clearing, Margaux's breath left her body. Sitting at the center of a perfectly maintained 50-acre clearing was a Gilded Age limestone behemoth, a sprawling, 40,000-square-foot architectural monument that looked like it had been lifted from Newport, Rhode Island, and set down in the remote Massachusetts wilderness. Copper turrets oxidized to pale green pierced the night sky. Massive stained glass windows caught the headlights and threw fractured color across the wet gravel. A sweeping marble staircase led to a set of towering oak double doors that had not been opened to a stranger in decades. There were no lights on inside. The house looked abandoned, yet flawlessly preserved. It was not a home. It was a fortress disguised as a mansion, built by men who understood that real power is the kind no one can see. "Welcome to the Belmont family's true headquarters," Abernathy said, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was so complete that Margaux could hear her own heartbeat. "Constructed by a steel magnate in 1912. Purchased by your father through an offshore holding firm named Aegis Capital. There is no public record connecting this property to the Belmont name. As far as the county assessor is concerned, this estate belongs to a defunct conservation trust." Margaux stepped out onto the gravel. The crunch of her boots sounded deafening in the mountain stillness. She followed Abernathy up the sweeping staircase to the double doors. There was no traditional lock, no keyhole, no handle. Hidden behind a decorative brass gargoyle mounted at eye level, Abernathy revealed a modern biometric retinal scanner. He leaned in. A thin laser swept across his eye. A heavy hydraulic hiss echoed from within the walls, and the massive doors clicked ajar. The interior was a masterwork of controlled paranoia, dressed in Gilded Age elegance. The grand foyer was adorned with imported Italian marble, a sweeping dual staircase, and a chandelier that scattered light across the ceiling like frozen starlight. But beneath the beauty, every system had been retrofitted for security. The temperature was precisely regulated. Cameras blinked silently from the shadowed corners of the crown molding, their lenses tracking movement. Abernathy led her through the foyer, past rooms filled with covered furniture and heavy velvet drapes, into a library that contained thousands of rare first editions behind locked glass cases. The air smelled of old paper and cedar. On a reading table near the fireplace, Margaux noticed a leather-bound notebook lying open. She stopped. The handwriting inside was her father's, the same sharp, angular script from the letter. But this was different. These were technical drawings, diagrams of mechanical systems, valve sequences, gear ratios, pressure calculations, page after page of meticulous engineering notes, written by a man who had spent years studying the bones of this house, the way a surgeon studies anatomy. She flipped through the pages carefully. Halfway through, she stopped. 3 pages had been cleanly removed. The torn edges were precise, deliberate, not ripped in haste but cut with a blade. 3 pages are missing, Margaux said. Abernathy came to her side and examined the notebook. His brow furrowed. I have never seen this book before, he said slowly. Your father never showed it to me. That admission settled over Margaux like cold water. If Abernathy, the man Hollis had trusted for 4 decades, had never seen this notebook, then there were layers to this house that even the lawyer did not know about. And the missing pages meant that the knowledge they contained had been deliberately separated, given to someone else, or hidden somewhere only a specific person could find. She tucked the notebook under her arm. She would need it later. Abernathy led her past the library, through a corridor behind a false bookcase that swung open on silent hinges, and down a spiral steel staircase into the earth. The temperature dropped with each step. The walls transitioned from plaster and wood to reinforced concrete, lit by stark LED strips that cast everything in cold, clinical white. This is the operations level, Abernathy said, his footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. Your father converted it over the last decade. Independent power supply, air filtration, communications array that operates on a frequency separate from any commercial network. They reached a heavy steel vault door. Beside it, a small computer terminal glowed with a single blinking cursor, the SD card Margaux. She pulled the tiny memory card from the hollow coin and slid it into the reader with the steadiness of a woman who threaded IV lines into collapsing veins for a living. The screens flickered to life. A loading bar flashed, decrypting the files through what Abernathy described as a proprietary encryption protocol. Then the screen went black, and a video file began to play. Hollis Belmont appeared on the screen. He looked frail. His usually broad shoulders were swallowed by a thick wool cardigan. His skin was sallow, stretched too tightly over the bones of his face. The sharp, ruthless tycoon the world knew was gone, replaced by a man running on something darker than ambition. But his eyes, that piercing, icy blue that Margaux had inherited, were as sharp and focused as a hawk watching prey from a mile up. Hello, Margaux. Hollis's recorded voice rasped from the speakers, and the sound sent a chill down her spine that settled at the base of her skull. If you are watching this, my final gamble paid off. You took the dollar. You did not walk away. I am so profoundly sorry for the theater of my will and for the years of silence. I pushed you away after your mother died because I saw Odette for what she was. A parasite. If she had known I loved you, you would have been a target. Your estrangement was your armor. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I will carry the weight of it into whatever comes after this life. Margaux pressed her hand against her mouth. She would not cry. Not yet. Now listen carefully, Hollis continued, and the grief in his recorded face was replaced by something colder, something predatory. 2 years ago, I hired an independent toxicologist from Johns Hopkins, a man named Dr. Winslow Pratt. I had begun experiencing symptoms that did not match my medical history. Cognitive decline, episodes of confusion, heart irregularities that appeared suddenly in a man with no prior cardiac disease. Dr. Pratt ran independent blood work and found trace amounts of digitalis in my system. Not enough to kill outright, enough to induce the symptoms of congestive heart failure and severe vascular dementia without raising alarms during a standard autopsy. Odette and Thatcher have been slowly poisoning me, Margaux. They have been murdering me to trigger the succession clause in the corporate charter and seize control of the board. Margot's legs went weak. She grabbed the edge of the computer terminal to steady herself. The bunker walls seemed to press inward. Digitalis. She knew exactly what it was and exactly what it did to a human body. She had treated it in the emergency room dozens of times. She understood the mechanism, the dosing, the way it could be used to destroy a person slowly enough that no one would ever think to look. They were murdering him, her father, and she had spent 5 years thinking he had simply stopped loving her. Odette and Thatcher think they have won the war, Hollis continued on the screen. A dark, predatory smile crept onto his face, the expression of a man who had lost his body but refused to lose the fight. They inherited Belmont Global Logistics. But what they do not know is that over the last 36 months, I have secretly leveraged the entire corporation. I saddled the company with billions in toxic debt, hidden through a network of shell companies, and I used that borrowed money to purchase physical, untraceable assets. Gold, bearer bonds, mineral rights, real estate held through entities that cannot be connected to the Belmont name. Behind the computer terminal, the heavy steel vault door suddenly clicked. The locking mechanisms disengaged with a loud, resonant clack that echoed through the bunker. Abernathy stepped forward and pushed the door open. Margaux turned. The room beyond was the size of a basketball court, carved from solid granite and lit by rows of industrial LED panels mounted to the ceiling. The air was cool, precisely climate-controlled, carrying the faint, metallic smell of polished metal. Stacked on heavy-duty industrial pallets in perfect military rows were ingots of solid Swiss gold bullion, each one gleaming under the harsh white light. Beside them, rows of climate-controlled safety deposit boxes overflowed with sheaves of bearer bonds, flawless uncut diamonds packed in black velvet cases, and thick folders containing deeds to commercial real estate on 3 continents and technology patents registered through untraceable holding companies. The vault you are looking at contains roughly $2.8 billion in liquid untraceable wealth. Hollis's voice echoed through the concrete brace. Margaux. Tax-free, profate-free, outside the reach of any court, any creditor, any government agency. But more importantly, the debt that is currently crushing Belmont Global Logistics, the loans that Odette and Thatcher are personally guaranteeing right now, thinking they are standard corporate instruments. You own those too. Aegis Capital is the primary creditor. When they inevitably default on the payments next month, you will have the legal right to foreclose on their shares, seize their personal assets, and throw them into the street with nothing. Hollis leaned closer to the camera. His breathing was labored. His eyes were wet. But there is something I did not finish, Margaux. Below this vault, there is a second level. I sealed it using a mechanical system that only Fenelwick knows how to operate. I could not risk putting it on any electronic network. Inside that second level is something more important than the gold. It is the evidence. The proof of everything they did to me. I ran out of time before I could organize it for you. Find Fennel. He will show you. And be careful. Odette is not as foolish as she appears. She will come looking. The screen went black. Margaux stood in the blinding light of the vault, surrounded by more wealth than most nations held in reserve. She looked at the gold, then at the dark screen, then down at the hollow peace dollar that had started it all, the 2 halves of the coin resting in her open palm like the split shell of something that had been waiting decades to hatch. Her father had not abandoned her. He had been dying in a cage built by the woman sleeping in his bed, and he had spent his last breath building a weapon and placing it in the only hands he trusted. The grief that had weighed her down for hours did not disappear. It transformed. It compressed into something denser, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. "Mr. Abernathy," Margaux said. Her voice had dropped. The tremor was gone. In its place was a stillness that the old lawyer recognized instantly because he had heard it once before decades ago from the mouth of Hollis Belmont himself. "Yes, Miss Sinclair, there is a second level below this vault that my father sealed, and a man named Fenelwick is the only person who can open it. My father said the evidence is inside. We need to find Fenelwick first thing in the morning, and we need to move fast. Because if my father was right about Odette, she is already looking for whatever he left behind." Abernathy studied her face in the cold light of the vault. The exhausted, heartbroken nurse from Bellevue was still there, somewhere behind those icy blue eyes. But something else had stepped forward. Something that had been forged in 14-hour emergency room shifts, in the silence of 5 years without a father, in the discipline of a woman who had rebuilt her entire life from nothing once before and was fully prepared to do it again. He nodded once. "I will have the car ready at dawn." Margaux closed her hand around the two halves of the coin. She turned away from the gold, away from the bearer bonds and the diamonds and the deeds, to properties she had never seen. She walked back through the vault door, past the computer terminal, where her father's ghost had just spoken to her, and up the spiral steel staircase into the dark, silent library of the Haven. She sat down in the leather chair beside the cold fireplace. She opened Hollis's engineering notebook to the page where the 3 sheets had been cut away, and she stared at the clean, deliberate edges where the missing knowledge had been removed and given to someone else. Somewhere in a small town at the base of this mountain, a 72-year-old machinist held the final pieces of her father's puzzle. And somewhere in Manhattan, 47 floors above a city that never stopped moving, Odette Belmont was sleeping peacefully in a penthouse she had stolen from a dead man, utterly certain that she had won. She had no idea what was coming. The town of Hargrove, Massachusetts, had 1 gas station, 1 diner, 1 post office, and exactly 0 reasons for a stranger to visit. So when Margaux Sinclair pulled the black Lexus onto the cracked asphalt of Main Street at 7:30 the following morning, every pair of eyes behind every window noticed. A woman in hospital scrubs and a worn blazer, driving a vehicle that cost more than most of the houses on the block, parking in front of Wick Ironworks and Machine Repair. The shop sat at the end of a dead-end road, a squat, soot-stained brick building with a corrugated steel roof and a hand-painted sign that had faded to near illegibility. Through the open bay door, Margaux could hear the rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil, a steady, unhurried percussion that spoke of decades of muscle memory. She stepped inside. The interior was a cathedral of mechanical craft. Lathes, drill presses, welding rigs, and tool racks lined every wall, organized with a precision that bordered on obsessive. The smell of cutting oil and hot metal hung in the air like incense. At the far end of the shop, illuminated by the blue-white flare of an acetylene torch, stood Fenelwick. He was 72 years old, built like a man who had spent his entire life lifting things that did not want to be lifted. His hands were enormous, scarred and calloused, with knuckles that looked like walnuts. His hair was white, cropped close to his skull, and his face had the weathered, creased texture of someone who had spent decades working in extreme heat and mountain cold. He wore a leather apron that looked older than Margaux herself. He shut off the torch when he saw her, flipping up his welding visor with one hand. His eyes were sharp, suspicious, and deeply cautious. "Help you?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, the kind of voice that came from breathing metal dust for 50 years. "My name is Margaux Sinclair. I am looking for Fenelwick. You found him." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the hollowed-out 1922 peace dollar. She held it out on her open palm, the two halves separated, the magnetic key fob visible in the shallow basin. Fenelwick went very still. The suspicion in his eyes shifted. He set down his torch, pulled off his heavy leather gloves, and walked slowly toward her. He did not look at her face. He looked at the coin. He reached out with one scarred finger and touched the key fob, turning it gently in the light. Then he examined the hinge mechanism of the coin itself, the microscopic seam, the spring-loaded release on the eagle's eye. "I machined this 15 years ago," he said quietly. His voice had changed. The gruffness was gone, replaced by something raw. "Hollis brought me the peace dollar and a set of engineering drawings, told me he needed a hollow vessel that could pass any visual inspection. Told me it was the most important thing he would ever ask me to build." He paused. I thought he was just being dramatic. Hollis could be theatrical when it suited him. He looked up at Margaux for the first time. His eyes swept over her face, searching. "He told me about you," he said. "Never met you. But he talked about you. Not often, not in front of anyone else. But late at night when we were working on the systems up at the house, he would mention his daughter. The nurse said you had steady hands and a stubborn streak that came straight from your mother." Margot's throat tightened, but she held his gaze. "Mr. Wick, my father is dead. He left me this coin and a property on this mountain. His lawyer brought me here last night. There is a second level beneath the main vault that my father sealed using a mechanical system. He said only you know how to operate. I need your help." Fennell turned away from her. He walked to his workbench, braced both hands against the edge, and stared down at the cluttered surface. His shoulders were rigid. 20 years, he said. His voice was low and tight. 20 years I maintained that house. Replaced the gate hydraulics twice. Rebuilt the water filtration. Repaired the masonry after the nor'easter in 14. Every winter, every spring. I drove up that mountain alone, worked in that essos alone, and came back down without telling a single living soul that it existed. He was not speaking to Margaux. He was speaking to the workbench, to the ghost of a man who was no longer alive to hear the accusation. And in 20 years, Hollis Belmont never once told me what he was actually doing up there. Never told me why the security had to be military grade. Never told me what was behind the doors I was not allowed to open. I was a tool to him, a useful tool, but a tool. He turned around and looked at Margot's, and she recognized the expression instantly. It was not fear. It was not reluctance. It was the banked fury of a man who had given 20 years of loyalty to someone who had not trusted him with the truth. "I understand that feeling, Mr. Wick," Margaux said. Fennell's eyes narrowed. "Do you? I spent 10 years thinking my father hated me. I thought he cut me out of his life because I was not useful to him. Because I refused to play a part in a family that was never mine. I put myself through nursing school on debt. I worked double shifts in an emergency room while he lived in a penthouse and never called." She paused. "I found out 12 hours ago that the silence was deliberate. That he did it to protect me. It does not erase the 10 years of thinking I was nothing to him. Being told it was strategy does not undo the damage." Fennell studied her. The anger in his face did not disappear, but it shifted. He recognized something in her words that resonated with his own wound. Two people, used by the same man, for different purposes, told only what they needed to know. "He has a letter," Margaux said. She pulled Hollis's handwritten note from the black envelope and unfolded it on the workbench. She pointed to a line near the bottom. Fennell leaned forward and read it. His jaw muscles worked. "Trust Fennell. He is the last person who remained loyal when loyalty was no longer profitable." Fennell read the line twice. He straightened up. He stared at the wall above the workbench. For a long time, at a framed photograph Margaux had not noticed before. It showed two men standing beside the iron gates of the haven, tools in hand, covered in grease and rust. One was Fennell, 20 years younger. The other was Hollis Belmont, sleeves rolled up, grinning at the camera, looking nothing like the dying man in the video. Fennell took a long breath. "I will take you up," he said. "But I want the truth this time. All of it. Whatever is behind those doors, I want to know." "You will," Margaux said. They drove up the mountain in Fennell's battered pickup truck, the Lexus too conspicuous and too fragile for the logging road in daylight. Abernathy followed in the Lexus as far as the paved road and then pulled off to wait, agreeing that fewer people on the property at once meant fewer chances of being observed. The haven looked different in daylight, less like a Gothic nightmare and more like a forgotten monument. The limestone walls were streaked with green where water had run for decades. The copper turrets stood against the gray sky like oxidized chess pieces. The ivy on the iron gates, torn open the night before, hung in ragged curtains, exposing the heavy metalwork beneath. Fennell led Margaux through the front doors and into the main hall. He moved through the house with the familiarity of a man who had memorized every floorboard, every hinge, every crack in the plaster. He ran his hand along the walls as he walked, reading the house the way Margaux read a patient's vital signs, by touch and instinct. In the library, he stopped at the massive stone fireplace that dominated the north wall. It was 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, built from rough-cut granite blocks fitted together without mortar. "Your father added this 5 years ago," Fennell said. He knelt down and pressed his hand against a specific stone in the lower left corner of the firebox. The stone shifted inward half an inch. He then reached up and pulled a decorative iron bracket on the mantelpiece. A section of the fireplace's back wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow passage barely wide enough for a single person. "I built the mechanism," Fennell said. "He never told your Mr. Abernathy about it. He told me it was a layer that had to exist outside the knowledge of any lawyer, in case the legal system itself was compromised. I thought he was being paranoid. Now I suspect he was being precise." They descended a steep, narrow stone staircase into a passage that ran beneath the main bunker. The air was cold and dry, carrying the faint smell of machine oil. At the bottom, they reached a heavy steel door fitted with a mechanical locking system unlike anything Margaux had seen before. 4 cast-iron valve wheels protruded from the door, each one roughly the size of a dinner plate, connected by visible gearing to heavy internal bolts. There was no electronic component anywhere. No keypad, no card reader, no biometric scanner. The entire system was purely mechanical, engineered to function without electricity, without a network, without any vulnerability that could be exploited remotely. "Pressure sequenced lock," Fennell said. "The valves have to be turned in a specific order, 2 specific pressures, within a specific time window. Wrong sequence, the bolts seize and the door becomes permanently locked. It would take cutting torches and 2 days to get through it by force." He cracked his knuckles and stepped up to the door. Working from memory, he turned the first valve 3 full rotations clockwise until the pressure gauge above it settled at a precise mark. Then the third valve counterclockwise, 2.5 turns. Then the second valve, then the fourth. Each turn produced a deep, resonant click from inside the door, the sound of massive bolts retracting. Margaux watched his hands. She noted the sequence, the direction, the pressure readings. She had spent years in the emergency room memorizing medication dosages, ventilator settings, and drug interaction protocols under extreme stress. Observation under pressure was not a skill she had to learn. It was who she was. The final bolt disengaged with a heavy, satisfying thud. Fennell stepped back and pulled the door open. The room beyond was small compared to the vault above, perhaps 12 feet by 15. The walls were bare concrete, the floor sealed with industrial epoxy. A single fluorescent fixture hummed to life automatically when the door opened. There was no gold here, no diamonds, no bearer bonds, no gleaming symbols of hidden wealth. Instead, against the far wall stood 3 fireproof safes, each one bolted to the floor. Margaux opened them one at a time. The first safe contained a thick file sealed in plastic. Inside were the original toxicology reports prepared by Dr. Winslow Pratt of Johns Hopkins University Hospital. The reports were notarized, dated, and co-signed by Dr. Pratt and an independent witness. The data was precise and devastating. Blood samples collected over a 14-month period showing a consistent non-therapeutic level of digitalis in Hollis Belmont's system. The concentration was carefully maintained below the threshold that would trigger suspicion in a routine screening, but high enough to produce progressive cardiac deterioration and cognitive impairment. There were chain of custody documents for each sample, making the evidence admissible. The second safe contained a portable hard drive loaded with financial records, extracted directly from the internal servers of Belmont Global Logistics. Spreadsheets, wire transfer records, board meeting minutes with forged signatures, and a detailed ledger of diversions from operating accounts to offshore entities controlled by Odette and Thatcher Joe Belmont. The extraction had been done by someone with root-level access to the company's systems, someone on the inside. The third safe contained a USB drive. Margaux plugged it into the computer terminal upstairs. A video loaded. It showed Hollis Belmont seated at a desk, alert and lucid, in a room Margaux did not recognize. The timestamp on the recording was 14 months before his death. Standing beside him was an older woman in a dark suit, a notary public, whose credentials were displayed on a placard in front of the camera. Beside her stood a man identified by a title card as a licensed Massachusetts attorney, independent of any firm connected to the Belmont family or Abernathy's practice. Hollis looked directly into the camera and, in a clear, steady voice, read aloud his complete testamentary intentions. He named Margaux as his sole intended heir. He described the creation of Aegis Capital, the transfer of assets, and the deliberate encumbering of Belmont Global Logistics with structured debt designed to be called by Aegis upon his death. He stated that any subsequent modifications to his publicly filed will were made under duress and cognitive impairment induced by the deliberate administration of Digitalis by Odette and Thatcher Belmont. The notary public stamped and signed. The Massachusetts attorney witnessed and countersigned. The video ran for 47 minutes. When it ended, Margaux sat in silence. This was the failsafe. If Odette challenged the will, if she claimed Hollis was mentally incompetent when he set up Aegis Capital, this video proved the opposite. And if Dr. Pratt was ever pressured to recant his findings, the original notarized reports in the first safe existed independently, outside the reach of any court order directed at Johns Hopkins or Dr. Pratt personally. Hollis had built redundancy into every layer. No single point of failure. No single person who could be threatened or bought. Margaux looked at Fennell, who was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "He built this for you," Fennell said. He did not know when he would die, or how, but he knew they would kill him eventually, and he needed the evidence to survive him. Margaux collected the toxicology reports, the hard drive and the USB drive. She locked the safes. Fennell sealed the door behind them and reset the pressure valves. As they climbed back up through the hidden passage behind the fireplace, Margaux's phone, which had been dead since crossing into Berkshire County, suddenly caught a fragment of signal. 2 bars, flickering. It buzzed 17 times in rapid succession. Missed calls and messages stacking up. 14 were from Soren Abernathy. 1 was from Bellevue Hospital. 2 were from an unknown number. She called Abernathy first. He answered on the first ring. His voice was tight. "Margaux, listen to me carefully. I have been contacted by a private investigator named Drummond Hale. He is former federal law enforcement. Odette Belmont hired him. He came to my office in Manhattan and asked me directly where I went the night of the will reading. He has GPS data from a tracking device attached to the undercarriage of the Lexus. The signal cut out when we left the paved highway, but he has narrowed the search radius to Berkshire County. He is on his way up here now." Margaux's stomach dropped. "How long?" "He left Manhattan 4 hours ago. If he is driving, he could reach Hargrove within the hour." Margaux looked at Fennell. "We need to leave the property." Now, they drove back down the mountain in Fennell's truck, the hard drive and files sealed in a waterproof tool bag wedged behind the seat. Margaux instructed Fennell to park at the diner in Hargrove, not at his shop. If Drummond Hale came to town asking questions, the shop would be the first place a man looking for mechanical expertise connected to an old estate would visit. She was right. 40 minutes later, sitting in a booth at the diner, with a cup of coffee she could not taste, Margaux watched through the rain-streaked window as a charcoal gray sedan pulled up in front of Wick Ironworks. A man stepped out. Drummond Hale was in his late 50s, compact and economical in his movements, wearing a dark jacket and no tie. He moved the way former law enforcement always moved, scanning the environment, cataloging exits, assessing threat levels without appearing to look at anything in particular. He tried the door of the shop. Locked. Fennell had locked it before they left. Drummond walked across the street to the post office. He was inside for 3 minutes. Then he came out and walked to the gas station. 5 minutes there. Then the hardware store. At each stop, Margaux could imagine the conversation. Casual. Professional. Have you ever seen a large estate property up in the hills? An older man named Abernathy? A black Lexus with New York plates? Nobody in Hargrove knew about the Haven. Fennell had made sure of that over 20 years. But Drummond was not looking for someone who knew. He was looking for someone who was hiding something. And the difference between knowing and hiding was the kind of gap that a man with 30 years of investigative experience could smell. He came to the diner last. He walked in, ordered a coffee at the counter, and sat 2 booths away from Margaux and Fennell. He did not look at them directly. He did not need to. He was absorbing the room. Margaux kept her eyes on her coffee. Fennell ate a plate of eggs with the unhurried calm of a man who had spent decades working alone and understood the value of appearing uninteresting. Drummond finished his coffee, paid, and left. He drove his sedan slowly through Hargrove's 3-block downtown, then turned north toward the highway that led up into the hills. He was going to drive the logging roads. He would not find the Haven today, because the turnoff was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, hidden behind a deadfall that Fennell had deliberately positioned years ago to camouflage the entrance. But he would be back. Men like Drummond Hale did not stop looking. 2 hours later, Margaux was back at the Haven with Abernathy. Fennell had returned to his shop to maintain the appearance of normalcy. They were reviewing the financial records from the second vault, when Margaux noticed something on the property's external camera feed that stopped her cold. On the monitor showing the eastern perimeter, beyond the stone wall that bordered the forest, a small black object was mounted to the trunk of an oak tree at roughly head height. It was angled toward the main gate. It had not been there the previous night. Margaux enlarged the image. The object was a compact surveillance camera, battery-powered, with a cellular antenna. Someone had hiked through the woods and placed it there within the last 12 hours, positioned to capture anyone entering or leaving through the main gates. She did not touch it. She did not tell Abernathy to remove it. Instead, she thought, if Drummond had placed the camera, removing it would confirm that someone was actively monitoring the estate's security feeds, which meant someone was inside the estate, which meant there was something worth guarding. Leaving the camera in place was smarter. It would capture images of Fennell's truck and the Lexus, but neither vehicle was registered in Margaux's name. And if she changed her entry and exit patterns, used the service road on the west side that Fennell had shown her, the camera would capture an empty gate and nothing else. She committed to the adjustment and moved on. Margaux walked to the window and studied the camera feed more carefully. The device was commercial grade, the kind available from any surveillance supply company for a few $100s. But the placement was professional. It was angled to maximize coverage of the gate while minimizing its own visibility from the ground. Someone who knew how to conduct surveillance had positioned it. Someone who understood sightlines and field of view. She called Fennell. There is a camera on the oak tree east of the gate. Did you see anyone near the perimeter in the last 24 hours? Fennell was quiet for a moment. I drove past the eastern access road around 4 yesterday afternoon on my way back from the lumber yard. There was a gray sedan parked at the pull-off near the creek crossing. I did not stop. It was gone when I came back through an hour later. Gray sedan, Drummond Hale's vehicle. Margaux made a decision. She would not remove the camera. She would not acknowledge it. She would use the western service road for all future access, a route that Fennell had maintained as an emergency path through a dense stand of hemlock trees, invisible from any public road. The camera would record an empty gate and nothing else. Eventually, whoever was watching would conclude that the property was unoccupied and move on. But she also knew that Drummond Hale was not a man who moved on. He was a man who narrowed his search radius until there was nowhere left to hide. The camera was not an endpoint. It was a step in a process, and the process was accelerating. She spent the rest of the evening cataloging the financial records from the second vault, organizing them by date and transaction type, building a timeline that mapped the embezzlement against the corporate calendar. The work was painstaking and repetitive, but it grounded her. It was the kind of systematic, detail-oriented labor she had performed thousands of times in the emergency room, reviewing charts, cross-checking medications, ensuring that every data point aligned before making a clinical decision. The skills were the same, only the stakes were different. By midnight, she had identified a pattern in the wire transfers that even the raw data had not made obvious at first glance. The diversions from Belmont Global's operating accounts to Odette's offshore entities followed a precise 28-day cycle. Every 4 weeks, like clockwork, a transfer was initiated. The amounts varied, sometimes 200,000, sometimes 3 million, but the timing was meticulously consistent. She noted it and moved on. The pattern would matter later. The next morning, Margaux called Colette from the encrypted phone. "Any more visitors?" "No," Colette said, "but the HR director called me in yesterday. She wanted to confirm that your leave of absence was voluntary and properly documented. She said she had received an external inquiry questioning whether you had abandoned your position." Who made the inquiry? She would not say, but she used the phrase "concerned family member." Odette. She was building a paper trail. If Margaux's employment status could be recharacterized as abandonment rather than approved leave, it would support a narrative of instability. A woman who abandoned her job, disappeared from public life, and could not be located by concerned relatives. It was the groundwork for something more aggressive than a private investigator and a surveillance camera. Margaux asked Colette to obtain a written confirmation from HR that her leave was formally approved, with dates and signatures. She asked her to keep a copy at the hospital and mail a second copy to a post office box in Springfield, Massachusetts, that Abernathy had established for document storage. Colette did not ask why. She simply said, "I will have it by end of day." 3 days passed. Margaux continued her work in the bunker, moving methodically through the financial records, building the case file that would eventually be delivered to federal investigators. She ate meals in the kitchen of the Haven, slept in a bedroom on the second floor that overlooked the clearing, and walked the perimeter each morning in the gray pre-dawn light, checking the tree line for anything that did not belong. On the third day, she found something. Not a camera this time. Not a person. A set of tire tracks on the Western Service Road, approximately 200 yards from the property's secondary entrance. The tracks were fresh, pressed into soft mud from the previous night's rain. They were from a vehicle with a wider wheelbase than Fennell's pickup truck. Someone had driven the service road. They had come close enough to see the secondary gate, then reversed and left. Margaux photographed the tracks, measured the wheelbase distance with a tape measure from the maintenance shed, and sent the images to Abernathy. His response was immediate. That is consistent with a full-size sedan. Hale drives a Chevrolet Impala. The net was tightening. Drummond Hale had found the eastern perimeter, placed a camera on the main gate, and was now probing the secondary access routes. He had not found the Haven itself yet, but he was systematically eliminating the places it was not. Eventually, through pure geographic process of elimination, he would find the logging road that led to the iron gates. Margaux calculated that she had, at most, another week before the Haven was compromised. The evidence needed to be out of the building and in the hands of attorneys before that happened. She worked faster. 4 days later, the second blow landed. It came from Baltimore, and it nearly broke the entire operation. Abernathy's encrypted phone rang at 6 in the morning. He listened without speaking for 4 minutes, then hung up and found Margaux in the library, where she had been cross-referencing the financial records from the second vault against Hollis's engineering notebook. "Dr. Winslow Pratt has withdrawn his cooperation," Abernathy said. His voice was flat. Margaux looked up. "What do you mean, withdrawn?" Odette's attorneys did not threaten him directly. They went through the hospital administration. Johns Hopkins received a formal inquiry from a law firm representing the Belmont estate, alleging that Dr. Pratt conducted unauthorized forensic testing on blood samples obtained without proper patient consent or institutional review board approval. They are threatening to report the hospital to the Department of Health and Human Services. If the inquiry proceeds, Dr. Pratt's medical license will be subject to a formal review. His 30-year career would be in jeopardy. And he caved. He called me this morning. He said, and I quote, "I cannot testify. They will destroy everything I have built. I am sorry. Margaux closed the notebook. She pressed her palms flat on the reading table and stared at the wood grain. The pattern of the oak swirled in tight, concentric rings, each one representing a year of growth, of survival, of slow and patient accumulation. She had lost her expert witness. Without Dr. Pratt standing in a courtroom or a deposition room and personally attesting to his findings, the toxicology reports were documents without a voice. Powerful on paper, but vulnerable to a well-funded legal attack that could challenge chain of custody, question methodology, or simply bury them under procedural objections until the statute of limitations expired. But she had something Odette did not know about. The original notarized reports in the second vault had been prepared with exactly this scenario in mind. Hollis had anticipated that witnesses could be silenced. The reports were co-signed by an independent witness, notarized and sealed with a chain of custody that did not depend on Dr. Pratt's continued cooperation. And the video in the third safe showed Hollis himself reading the toxicology results aloud, in a room with a licensed attorney and a notary public, creating a recorded testimonial that existed independent of any living witness. More importantly, Margaux realized something that neither Abernathy nor Hollis had accounted for, because neither of them had spent a decade working in emergency medicine. She knew digitalis, not as a legal abstraction or a line item in a forensic report, but as a clinical reality she had managed with her own hands. She had treated digitalis toxicity in patients at Bellevue. She understood the pharmacokinetics, the half-life, the way chronic low-dose exposure affected the sinoatrial node and the cognitive centers differently than acute poisoning. She understood why a standard autopsy would miss it and what specific post-mortem tests would reveal it. If Dr. Pratt would not testify, Margaux could not replace his credentials, but she could prepare a clinical analysis of the toxicology data that would allow any qualified expert to verify the findings independently. She did not need Dr. Pratt. She needed his data, and she had the originals. She spent the next 2 days at the computer terminal in the Havens bunker, building a detailed pharmacological summary from the original reports. She cross-referenced the digitalis concentrations against published research on chronic subclinical exposure, documented the expected symptom progression, and mapped it against the timeline of Hollis's medical records that Abernathy had obtained through a separate legal channel. The correlation was exact. The decline in cognitive function, the cardiac irregularities, the onset of symptoms that had been attributed to natural aging, every single marker aligned precisely with the pattern of deliberate, sustained digitalis administration. When she finished, she had a 30-page document that could be handed to any board-certified toxicologist in the country and verified within 48 hours. Dr. Pratt's name was nowhere on it. The data spoke for itself. While Margaux was working in the mountains, Odette Belmont was waging a different kind of war in Manhattan. Margaux learned about it from the last person she expected to hear from. Her phone rang late on a Tuesday night. The caller ID showed Bellevue Hospital. It was Colette Marsh. Colette was 41, a charge nurse on Margaux's unit, and the closest thing Margaux had to a best friend. She was practical, profane, fiercely protective of her nurses, and the only person at Bellevue who had not asked Margaux a single question when she had requested emergency leave the morning after the will reading. "Margaux, someone came to the hospital today asking about you," Colette said. No preamble, no small talk. "Who?" "A man. Late 50s, gray jacket, no tie. Showed a business card that said he was a private consulting investigator. He asked the unit secretary for your schedule, your emergency contact information, and your home address. Denise told him to go to HR. He went to HR. They told him they could not release employee information without a subpoena. He left. But Margaux, he was back in the parking garage an hour later. I saw him from the window. He was photographing the employee entrance, Drummond Hale. He was building a file on her from every available angle, not just tracking her to the Haven, but constructing a comprehensive profile, her routines, her associates, her vulnerabilities. "Colette," Margaux said carefully, "I need to tell you something, but I need you to understand that knowing this will put you in a position that could become uncomfortable. I have been an ER nurse for 19 years. Uncomfortable is my baseline. Talk. Margaux told her the minimum she needed to know: her father's death, the suspicion of foul play, the evidence she was collecting, the pressure campaign from Odette's legal team. She did not mention the Haven, the vault, or the $2.8 billion. She kept it tight. My stepmother may have killed my father, Margaux said. I am gathering the evidence to prove it. The man who came to Bellevue works for her. If anyone else comes asking about me, I need to know immediately. And I need you to confirm with hospital administration that I am on approved medical leave. That fact may become important very soon. Done, Colette said. No hesitation. No questions about whether Margaux was certain, whether she had considered the consequences, whether this was a fight she could win. Colette Marsh had spent 2 decades working alongside trauma surgeons and knew that when someone told you the diagnosis, you did not debate it. You responded, Margaux, Colette said before hanging up. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, you call me. 12 days after the will reading, the escalation Margaux had been dreading arrived. Abernathy called her at dawn. His voice carried a quality she had not heard from the old lawyer before. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to urgency that had been tightly controlled and was beginning to fray at the edges. Odette has filed an emergency petition with the Manhattan Surrogates Court, he said. She is seeking a judicial declaration of mental incompetence against you. Margaux set down her coffee. She was standing in the kitchen of the Haven, looking out the window at the fog that blanketed the clearing every morning like a slow white tide. On what grounds? The petition alleges that you have exhibited erratic and delusional behavior since the will reading, that you abandoned your employment without notice, that you have been unreachable by family members who claim to be concerned about your welfare, and that your recent conduct, and I am quoting the filing directly, suggests a dissociative break from reality, potentially rendering her incapable of managing financial or legal affairs. Margaux almost laughed, almost. The audacity was breathtaking. Odette was not trying to find the hidden assets. She was trying to neutralize Margaux legally, to have her declared incompetent so that any action taken by Aegis Capital could be challenged on the grounds that its sole beneficiary was mentally unfit. Who is the judge? Margaux asked. Aldrich Pemberton. Surrogates Court. The hearing is scheduled for 9 days from now. Is that normal? A hearing that fast? No, Abernathy said. It is not. Emergency competency petitions typically take 3 to 6 weeks to calendar. 9 days suggests the scheduling was arranged in advance. The implication was clear. Pemberton was not a neutral arbiter. He had been placed. Margaux had a choice. She could stay in the mountains, continue building her case in safety, and let Abernathy fight the petition on her behalf. If the court ruled against her in absentia, the damage would be severe but potentially reversible on appeal. Or she could go back to Manhattan, walk into the courtroom, and face Odette directly, which meant exposing herself, leaving the safety of the Haven, and trusting that the evidence she had assembled was strong enough to withstand whatever Odette's legal team had prepared. Abernathy counseled patience. Stay here, he said. Let me handle the petition. Going back exposes you to risks we have not fully mapped. My father hid in the dark because he had no other choice, Margaux said. I have a choice, and I am not going to let a bought judge declare me insane based on a filing by the woman who murdered my father. The confrontation she had been avoiding came on the morning she left for Manhattan. Margaux was loading the waterproof tool bag into the trunk of Fennell's pickup truck when the sound of tires on gravel reached her from the service road. Not Fennell's truck, not Abernathy's Lexus. A different engine entirely, heavier, idling with the patient rumble of a vehicle that had been driven a long distance by someone in no particular hurry. She closed the trunk. Her hands were steady. She had rehearsed this possibility a dozen times in her mind, calculating responses, mapping exits, preparing for the moment when the perimeter would be breached, and the fiction of invisibility would end. A charcoal gray Chevrolet Impala emerged from the hemlock stand and rolled to a stop 30 yards from the front steps of the Haven. The driver's door opened. Drummond Hale stepped out. He looked exactly as he had in the diner, compact, economical, wearing the same dark jacket and no tie. But this time he was not performing the casual disinterest of a man ordering coffee. He was standing in the open, hands visible, making direct eye contact with Margaux across the gravel clearing. His posture communicated a single, unmistakable message. I found you. Now what? Miss Sinclair, he said. His voice carried easily in the mountain air. Or do you prefer the name on the Aegis Capital Incorporation documents? I have been going back and forth on that. Margaux did not move from the truck. She calculated. Running was pointless. Denial was pointless. The man had found the service road, which meant he had spent days systematically eliminating every other logging road, fire trail, and access path within a 20-mile radius until only one was left. He was thorough. He was professional. And he was standing on property that, as of 9:30 the previous morning, legally belonged to Margaux Sinclair through a chain of shell corporations that this man had apparently unraveled in less than a month. What do you want, Mr. Hale? Margaux said. Drummond walked a few steps closer. He stopped at the base of the marble staircase, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at the limestone facade of the Haven, with an expression that was more appreciative than threatening. I want to give you some information, he said. Free of charge, which, given my hourly rate, should tell you how seriously I am taking this conversation. Margaux waited. I was hired by Odette Belmont to locate you and determine the nature of your activities following the will reading. I have done that. I know where you are. I know what this property is. I have a reasonable inference about what is inside it, based on the security infrastructure I have observed and the financial movements I have traced through public filings. Drummond paused. What I have not done is report any of this to my client. Margaux's eyes narrowed. Why not? Because I spent 26 years as a federal agent, Ms. Sinclair. I investigated financial crimes. I built cases against people who used corporate structures to hide theft, fraud, and worse. And in my professional assessment, the woman who hired me is going to be the subject of a federal investigation within the next 6 months, whether you pursue it or not. The financial irregularities at Belmont Global Logistics are visible to anyone with subpoena power and the inclination to look. The only reason no one has looked yet is that Hollis Belmont was the kind of man who inspired loyalty in regulators, and his death has not yet triggered the routine audits that would expose the rot. He looked at Margaux with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a professional who had encountered something in the field that exceeded the scope of his assignment, and who was making a judgment call about which side of the line he wanted to stand on when the dust settled. I am terminating my contract with Odette Belmont effective today, Drummond said. I will inform her that my investigation was inconclusive and that I was unable to determine your whereabouts or activities. That will buy you approximately 2 to 3 weeks before she hires someone else. I suggest you use that time wisely. Why are you doing this? Margaux asked. She did not trust generosity from strangers. She had spent a decade in an emergency room where the most dangerous patients were often the ones who seemed the calmest. Drummond considered the question. He looked up at the house, then back at Margaux. Because I read the toxicology data that was filed with the Delaware Chancery Court last week as part of the Aegis Capital disclosure, he said quietly. The digitalis concentrations, the 14-month timeline, the correlation with cognitive decline. I have seen that pattern before, Ms. Sinclair. Not in a corporate fraud case, in a homicide investigation. And I do not work for murderers. He turned, walked back to the Impala, and opened the driver's door. Before getting in, he paused. For what it is worth, he said, your father was smarter than anyone I have ever investigated. And I investigated a lot of smart people. Whatever he built here, he built it to last. The Impala reversed down the service road and disappeared into the hemlock stand. The sound of the engine faded into the mountain silence. Margaux stood beside Fennell's truck for a full minute, breathing the cold air, recalibrating. Drummond Hale had just given her the most valuable thing a former adversary could give. Time. 2 to 3 weeks before Odette sent someone new. Combined with the 9 days until the margin call and the competency hearing, the timeline was tight but workable. She got into the truck and drove down the mountain to the train station. Margaux spent the next 4 days preparing for 2 battles simultaneously. During the day, she worked on the legal strategy for the competency hearing, reviewing the medical leave documentation Colette had secured, coordinating with the independent psychiatrist Abernathy had retained for her evaluation, and studying the procedural rules of the surrogate's court so that nothing in the hearing room would catch her by surprise. At night, she continued assembling the evidence package for the federal filing. The financial records from the second vault, Kirshner's embezzlement documentation, the toxicology data, and her own pharmacological analysis were organized into a single coherent file, cross-referenced and indexed, with a cover memo that laid out the criminal case in language precise enough for a federal prosecutor and clear enough for a jury. She worked in the library of the Haven, at the reading table near the fireplace, where she had first discovered her father's engineering notebook. The notebook sat beside her laptop, open to the pages, immediately preceding the 3 that had been removed. She had studied those pages dozens of times now, reading the technical drawings, the valve specifications, the gear ratios. She understood now that the missing pages contained the operating instructions for the pressure-sequenced lock on the second vault level. Hollis had removed them and given them to Fennell as physical keys, knowledge that could not be hacked, could not be subpoenaed, could not be extracted from any server or filing cabinet. The only way to access the evidence was to physically stand in front of the door with a man who had memorized the sequence. It was the most analog form of encryption imaginable, and it was unbreakable. On the morning she left for Manhattan, Margaux walked through the Haven one final time. She checked the cameras, verified that the service road gate was secured, and set the climate control to maintenance mode. She stood in the vault for a moment, looking at the rows of gold bullion and the empty computer terminal, where her father's face had appeared on the screen 3 weeks earlier. She did not feel awe at the wealth anymore. She felt responsibility. The gold was not a prize, it was a tool, and tools were only as valuable as the hands that used them and the purpose they served. She locked the vault, climbed the spiral staircase, and walked out through the front doors into the cold November morning. Fennell was waiting in his pickup truck at the base of the marble staircase. He drove her to the train station in Pittsfield, where she caught a southbound Amtrak to Penn Station. They did not speak much during the drive. They did not need to. The work between them had created a bond that did not require constant verbal maintenance. The kind of understanding that forms between people who have shared labor and shared risk, and emerged from both with their respect for each other intact. At the station, Fennell handed her a small paper bag. "Sandwiches," he said, "turkey and Swiss. The bread is from the bakery in Hargrove. It is better than anything you will find on that train." Margaux took the bag. She looked at the old machinist, standing beside his truck in his leather apron and work boots, his white hair bright against the gray sky, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. The particular specific warmth of being cared for by someone who expected nothing in return. "Thank you, Fennell." He nodded once. "Go win your fight," he said. "Then, come back and help me fix the East Wing plumbing. I am not doing that job alone." She boarded the train. As it pulled out of the station, she opened the paper bag and ate one of the sandwiches. The bread was excellent. Fennell was right. 2 days before the hearing, Margaux received a communication that changed the architecture of the entire fight. It came through the encrypted channel Abernathy had established for secure communications, a military-grade messaging system that routed through multiple anonymizing servers. The sender identified himself as Nolan Kirshner. Margaux knew the name. Nolan Kirshner was the interim chief financial officer of Belmont Global Logistics, appointed by Odette 6 weeks before Hollis's death, ostensibly to stabilize the company's finances during Hollis's decline. Margaux had assumed he was Odette's creature, installed to manage the embezzlement from a position of authority. She was wrong. Kirshner's message was precise and clinical. He stated that he had been placed inside Belmont Global Logistics by Hollis Belmont 4 years prior, operating as a financial monitor embedded within Odette's operational structure. His mandate was to document every illicit transaction, every fraudulent filing, every diverted dollar, and to preserve that documentation in a form that would be admissible in federal court. Hollis had selected him specifically because Kirshner had no prior connection to the Belmont family, no social ties to the firm, and no vulnerability that could be leveraged. Kirshner provided a piece of information that Margaux had not known. 6 months before Hollis's death, during the period when the digitalis was most severely impairing his cognitive function, Odette had brought a revised will to Hollis for signature. The revision increased Odette's share of the publicly held assets from 40% to 60% and eliminated a clause that had previously allocated a portion of the company's operating profits to a charitable trust in Margaux's mother's name. Hollis had signed it. He had been in no condition to refuse. If Margaux could prove that Hollis was under the influence of digitalysis at the time of the revision, the amended will would be voided. The original will, written years earlier when Hollis was in full command of his faculties, would take effect instead. And the original will gave Margaux 40% of the publicly held company, in addition to the hidden assets in the Haven's vault. Margaux shared Kirshner's information with Abernathy. The lawyer's reaction was immediate and visceral. "How do we know he is not a plant?" Abernathy said. "Odette could have sent him. This could be a trap to lure you into making a claim based on fabricated evidence, which they then discredit in court." "My father mentioned someone inside the company," Margaux said, in the video. "He said no single person knows everything. He designed the plan with compartmentalized knowledge. He did not tell you about the passage behind the fireplace. He did not tell Fennel about the vault. Why would he tell you about Kirshner?" Abernathy considered this. His instinct was to distrust. 40 years of legal practice had taught him that every offer of help was a potential trap. But Margaux trusted her own reading. Kirshner's message contained a specific detail that only someone with intimate access to Belmont Global's financial architecture could know. A reference to a backup server protocol that Hollis had described in one of the technical entries in his engineering notebook. The same notebook that had been sitting in the library of the Haven, unseen by Abernathy, until Margaux found it. This was the first time in the entire operation that Margaux overrode Abernathy's judgment. The lawyer wanted to wait, to verify, to proceed with caution. Margaux looked at the calendar. The competency hearing was in 2 days. Kirshner's information about the amended will was the ammunition she needed to reframe the entire fight. Caution was a luxury she could no longer afford. She authorized Kirshner to prepare a complete financial disclosure package, including the documentation of the amended will and the records of every embezzlement transaction he had cataloged over 4 years. She instructed him to deliver it to a second attorney, independent of Abernathy's firm, who would hold it in escrow until the hearing. Abernathy watched her make the call. When she hung up, he was quiet for a long moment. "You are taking a risk," he said. "My father took risks for 3 years while he was being poisoned in his own bed. He trusted his judgment about people, about you, about Fennel, about Kirshner. I am his daughter, Mr. Abernathy. Trusting my judgment about people is not a weakness. It is the thing I inherited from him that actually matters." The hearing took place in a paneled courtroom on the 4th floor of the Manhattan Surrogates Court. It was a Tuesday morning, overcast and cold, and the courtroom was nearly empty. Competency hearings were not public spectacles. They were quiet, procedural affairs designed to happen behind closed doors. Odette arrived with a team of 4 attorneys from a white shoe litigation firm. She wore a charcoal gray suit and minimal jewelry, the calculated image of a concerned stepmother forced to take painful legal action for a family member's own good. She did not look at Margaux. Margaux sat on the opposite side of the aisle with Abernathy, and a second attorney Abernathy had retained specifically for this hearing, a woman named Portia Salcedo, who specialized in judicial corruption and white-collar fraud. Judge Aldrich Pemberton entered the courtroom and took the bench. He was 68, silver-haired, with the performative gravity of a man who had spent decades cultivating the appearance of impartiality. He wore a signet ring on his left hand and reading glasses on a gold chain around his neck. Odette's lead counsel presented the petition. He was smooth, practiced, and devastatingly effective. He described Margaux's sudden disappearance from her job, her failure to respond to family outreach, her isolation in an undisclosed location. and the opinion of a psychiatric consultant, a doctor who had never examined Margaux, who nonetheless opined that her behavior pattern was consistent with a dissociative episode triggered by the traumatic experience of the will reading. Abernathy responded with controlled precision. He presented documentation that Margaux's leave from Bellevue Hospital was formally approved, confirmed by the hospital's own HR department. He presented a psychological evaluation conducted by an independent psychiatrist 3 days earlier, establishing that Margaux was alert, oriented, and in full command of her cognitive and legal faculties. He presented Margaux herself, seated calmly at the defense table, visibly composed, answering procedural questions with the steady, articulate clarity of a woman who spent her professional life making life and death decisions under extreme pressure. The evidence was clearly on Margaux's side. The petition was thin, speculative, and based entirely on the opinion of a doctor who had never met the subject. But Judge Pemberton did not seem interested in the evidence. He listened to Abernathy's presentation with the vaguely distracted air of a man whose decision had already been made. He asked no follow-up questions of the independent psychiatrist. He nodded along to Odette's counsel, with noticeably more engagement than he afforded to Abernathy. When Abernathy finished, Pemberton shuffled his papers and cleared his throat in a way that suggested he was about to issue a ruling, and the ruling was not going to be favorable. Portia Salcedo stood up. "Your Honor, before the court issues a ruling, I would like to enter an exhibit into the record." Pemberton looked at her over his reading glasses. His expression tightened. He had not been briefed on a second attorney. "Counselor, you are not listed on the original filing. Ms. Salcedo is co-counsel for the respondent, Your Honor," Abernathy said smoothly. "She was retained 48 hours ago in response to information that became available after the initial filing." Salcedo opened a leather portfolio and placed a single document on the lectern. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "This exhibit is a certified financial disclosure from the Office of Court Administration's Inspector General, obtained through an expedited public records request. It details 18 payments totaling $340,000 made from a corporate entity called Harmon Fiduciary Services to a personal account held at Chase Manhattan in the name of Aldrich J. Pemberton over a period of 18 months. The courtroom went silent. "Harmon Fiduciary Services," Salcedo continued, "is a shell corporation whose beneficial owner, as recorded in Delaware Secretary of State, filings made available through a Freedom of Information request last week, is Odette Belmont." Pemberton's face lost its color. His right hand, the one with the signet ring, gripped the edge of the bench. "These payments coincide precisely with the period during which Mrs. Belmont consolidated control of the Belmont estate," Salcedo said. "They represent a potential violation of Section 240 of the New York Judicial Conduct Code and may constitute federal bribery under Title 18 of the United States Code. We are not asking this court to rule on that matter. We are asking this court to recognize that the presiding judge has a material, undisclosed financial relationship with the petitioner, and to recuse accordingly." Pemberton sat motionless for 11 seconds. The court reporter's fingers were frozen above her stenotype machine. Odette's lead counsel had turned the color of old parchment. "This court," Pemberton said, his voice barely above a whisper, "will recuse from this matter." He stood, gathered his papers with shaking hands, and disappeared through the door behind the bench. The petition for mental incompetence was transferred to a substitute judge, who dismissed it within the hour on grounds of insufficient evidence. Margaux walked out of the courthouse into the cold Manhattan air. The city was gray and loud around her, taxis honking, pedestrians streaming past on the sidewalk, pigeons exploding from a vendor's cart in a flurry of wings. She stood on the granite steps and breathed. The hearing was over. The incompetence play was dead. Pemberton was finished, his career effectively ended by a single sheet of paper. But the information that had made it possible, the financial records linking Pemberton to Odette's Shell Corporation, had come from Nolan Kirshner, the man Abernathy had wanted to distrust, the man Marge had chosen to believe. She had been right. Abernathy stepped up beside her on the courthouse steps. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from the old lawyer before. It was not pride exactly. It was recognition. The acknowledgement that the person standing beside him was no longer someone he was protecting. She was someone he was following. Margaux reached into her pocket and felt the two halves of the hollowed-out piece dollar. She pressed them together until the seam disappeared and the coin felt solid again in her palm. She had the toxicology evidence. She had the financial records. She had Kirshner on the inside. She had the video will. And in 9 days, when the structured debt of Belmont Global Logistics came due, and Aegis Capital called the margin, Odette Belmont would discover that the daughter she had mocked with a $1 coin now owned the ground beneath her feet. Mr. Abernathy, Margaux said. Yes, Ms. Sinclair. Call Kirshner. Tell him to prepare the Aegis Capital acceleration documents and contact the FBI, the SE's district attorney's office. I want everything filed simultaneously. When it hits, I want it to hit from every direction at once. No gaps. No time to react. No exit. Abernathy studied her face. The November wind cut across the courthouse steps and lifted the collar of her blazer. And the boardroom meeting? Schedule it for the morning the margin call goes live. I want to be standing in that room when they find out. She descended the courthouse steps, crossed the street, and disappeared into the crowd. Behind her, 47 floors above the financial district, in a mahogany-paneled boardroom that still smelled of expensive cologne and inherited arrogance, the clock was ticking down towards zero. And the people who had laughed at a $1 coin had absolutely no idea that the woman they had dismissed was about to walk back through those doors and burn their empire to the foundation. 9 days later, on a Monday morning so cold that the steam rising from the manholes on Park Avenue looked like the breath of something alive beneath the streets, the structured debt of Belmont Global Logistics came due. At precisely 9:30, Aegis Capital's legal counsel, a firm Margaux had never heard of until Abernathy produced their retainer agreement from a locked drawer in his office, filed simultaneous acceleration notices with the New York State Supreme Court, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Delaware Chancery Court. The notices were surgical. They demanded immediate repayment of $4.2 billion in leveraged obligations that Odette and Thatcher Belmont had personally guaranteed as part of the corporate succession they had so eagerly inherited. At 9:31, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime division received a sealed evidence package containing the notarized toxicologies, reports from the Haven's second vault, the complete financial records extracted by Nolan Kirshner, and a cover letter from Portia Salcedo summarizing the case for criminal charges, including embezzlement, securities fraud, and second-degree murder by poisoning. At 9:32, the New York District Attorney's Office received an identical package. At 9:33, Interpol received a request to freeze all accounts held by Odette Belmont, Thatcher Belmont, and their associated corporate entities in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and the Channel Islands. Margaux had spent 7 days orchestrating the timing. Every filing was synchronized to land within a 3-minute window. Before the markets opened, before Odette's lawyers could respond to the first notice and mobilize against the second, before anyone in the Belmont organization could pick up a phone and warn someone else to start shredding documents. Abernathy had called it the most precisely coordinated legal offensive he had witnessed in 4 decades of practice. Margaux had simply called it Tuesday. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in the suite Abernathy had arranged at a midtown hotel. The woman looking back at her was almost unrecognizable from the exhausted nurse who had walked into this same city 5 weeks ago in scrubs and a worn blazer. She was wearing a bespoke midnight black suit, tailored in a single fitting by a Saint Laurent atelier that Abernathy had quietly arranged. The cut was sharp, architectural, designed to convey authority without ostentation. Her dark blonde hair was down, brushed to a clean shine, falling just past her shoulders. She wore no jewelry except a simple watch with a leather band. She reached into the pocket of the suit jacket and touched the 1922 piece dollar. The coin sat whole in her pocket, the seam invisible, unless you knew where to feel for it. She picked up the waterproof tool bag containing the hard drive, the USB with the video will, and a copy of her pharmacological analysis of the digitalis data. She had 3 additional copies stored in 3 separate locations, one with Portia Salcedo, one in a safe deposit box at a bank in Springfield, Massachusetts, and one with Fennel Wick, who had driven it to his sister's house in Vermont 2 days earlier without being told what was on it. No single point of failure. Before she left the hotel, Margaux made one more call. She dialed Fennel Wick's number. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did, without greeting, without preamble. "It is done," Margaux said. "The filings went out this morning. FBI, SCC, District Attorney. All of it." Fennel was quiet for a long moment. She could hear the faint sound of his shop in the background, the low hum of a lathe idling, the tick of cooling metal. "Good," he said. "There is going to be a boardroom meeting this morning. I am going to walk in there and tell them who I am." Another pause. Longer this time. "Your father would have done the same thing," Fennel said. "But he would have done it angry. You are doing it clear. That is the difference." "Fennel," Margaux said, "when this is over, I am coming back to the Haven." "I know," he said. "I have already started drawing up renovation plans. The plumbing in the East Wing needs to be completely replaced if you are going to run water to more than 4 rooms." Margaux almost smiled. It was the closest she had come to smiling in 3 weeks. "Thank you, Fennel. For everything," he grunted. That was his way. Then, he said something he had never said before in all the weeks of working together, in all the phone calls and the drives up the mountain and the hours spent in the cold belly of the Haven. "Your mother would have been proud of you," he said. "I never met her. But from what Hollis told me, she would have been proud." He hung up before Margaux could respond. She stood in the hotel room for a moment, holding the phone against her chest, breathing. Then she picked up the tool bag, put on her coat, and walked out the door. On the morning of the boardroom meeting, Margaux's phone rang at 6:15. It was Colette. "I saw the news," Colette said. There was no preamble, as always. Federal agents raiding a penthouse on the Upper East Side. "Belmont Global Logistics under investigation. Your stepmother's name in every headline. It is all over the hospital break room television." Margaux was standing in the hotel suite, buttoning the cuff of the Saint Laurent jacket. The television was off. She had not watched the news. She did not need to. "Are you safe?" Colette asked. "I am safe." "Are you going to do something today that you cannot undo?" "Yes," Margaux said. Colette was quiet for a moment. Margaux could hear the background noise of the hospital, the distant intercom pages, the beeping of monitors, the low murmur of a unit waking up for morning rounds. The sounds of the life she had lived for a decade. The sounds of the life she was about to leave behind, at least in its current form. "Then do it right," Colette said, "and when it is over, call me. I want to hear your voice. Not the news version. Your version. I will." "Margaux, one more thing." Colette paused. "Whatever happens today, you are still a nurse. Do not let anyone in that room make you forget that. The suits change. The job does not." Margaux looked at her reflection in the hotel mirror. The midnight black jacket, the clean lines, the authority that the clothes were designed to project. Underneath the jacket, against her skin, she could still feel the ghost pressure of a stethoscope around her neck. The weight she had carried for 10 years, the weight she would carry again. "I will not forget," Margaux said. She put the phone in her pocket beside the peace dollar and walked out the door. The car was waiting downstairs. Abernathy was already at Belmont Tower, having arrived at 8 to ensure that the building's security systems had been updated to reflect the ownership transfer that had become effective at midnight. Nolan Kirshner was inside the building, at his desk on the executive floor, maintaining his cover until the exact moment it was no longer necessary. Margaux into the car. The driver pulled into traffic on Park Avenue, heading south toward the financial district. The city moved around her in its relentless Monday rhythm. Commuters with coffee cups, delivery trucks double parked, steam and noise and concrete. She watched it pass through the tinted window and felt a strange, dislocating calm. The last time she had entered Belmont Tower, she had been invisible, an afterthought, a punchline in a dead man's will. She had walked out of the boardroom with a single coin in her shaking hand and tears on her face, and no one in the building had given her a second glance. If you have ever walked back into a place where you were humiliated, If you have ever returned to a room that tried to break you, then you know that the hardest part is not the confrontation. The hardest part is the elevator ride. The 30 seconds between the lobby and the floor, where it happened, when your body remembers what your mind has already decided to overcome. Stay with Margaux through that elevator ride, because what she does in the next 20 minutes will be something you remember for the rest of your life. The atmosphere inside the executive boardroom of Belmont Tower was unrecognizable from the polished theater of the will reading. The mahogany table was cluttered with open laptops, scattered printouts, and half-empty coffee cups. The scent of expensive cologne had been replaced by stale caffeine and the acrid undercurrent of panic sweat. Odette Belmont stood at the head of the table, gripping the back of her chair with both hands. Her normally immaculate appearance had fractured. Her Chanel jacket was wrinkled across the shoulders. Her hair was pulled back hastily, and her lipstick had been applied unevenly, as though her hands had been shaking when she put it on. Thatcher sat slumped 3 chairs down, staring at the screen of his iPad with the hollow, disbelieving expression of a man watching his own house burn on a security camera feed. Lizette was standing by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, rhythmically pressing her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger, hard enough to leave a mark. A senior partner from Morgan Stanley sat at the far end of the table, his face carefully neutral in the way that banking professionals adopt when they are about to deliver news that will end a client relationship permanently. What do you mean they are calling the margin? Odette's voice cracked across the room. She slammed one palm down on the mahogany. Explain to me, in terms I can understand, what is happening to my company. I mean exactly that, Mrs. Belmont, the banker said. He adjusted his collar. The holding company, Aegis Capital, has officially accelerated all outstanding leverage obligations tied to Belmont Global Logistics. Your late husband apparently structured these instruments over a period of 36 months, using the company's operating assets as collateral. The grace period expired at midnight. The corporate accounts are overdrawn by $400 million. They have initiated a freeze on all Belmont Global operating accounts pending resolution. This is illegal, Thatcher shouted. He shoved himself out of his chair, sending it rolling backward into the wall. My father left us this company free and clear. Who even owns Aegis Capital? I want a name. I want an address. I want someone in this room to tell me who is doing this to us. You cannot have a name, Thatcher, Odette snapped. She rubbed her temples with both hands. It is a blind trust registered in Delaware. The beneficial ownership is shielded behind 5 layers of corporate structure. Our attorneys have been trying to pierce it for weeks. She paused. We just need time. If we can secure a bridge loan from another institution and restructure the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. The room fell dead silent. Soren Abernathy walked through the doorway first, clutching a thick leather folio against his chest, his expression as unreadable as it had been on the day of the will reading. But it was the woman walking slightly ahead of him that caused the blood to drain from Odette Belmont's face. Margaux Sinclair did not look like the exhausted, heartbroken nurse who had been laughed out of this room 5 weeks before. Her posture was flawless, her stride unhurried, her expression carrying a terrifying serenity that was more unsettling than anger could ever have been. She walked directly toward the head of the table where Odette was standing. Odette did not move. Her hands were still gripping the back of the chair, and her knuckles had gone white. Margaux? Lizette whispered from the window, her voice cracking with disbelief. What are you doing here? Security is supposed to have this building on lockdown. No one gets to this floor without authorization. Security works for the building's owner, Lizette, Margaux said. Her voice carried effortlessly across the room, steady and unhurried, the way she had spoken to panicking interns over the body of a coding patient. And as of 9:30 this morning, Aegis Capital officially took possession of Belmont Tower due to a failure to meet immediate debt obligations. Your security team reports to me now. Odette let out a sharp, breathless laugh. The sound was high and thin, the involuntary response of a mind trying to reject information that it could not process. You? You are Aegis Capital? That is not possible. You are a nurse from Queens. You live in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. You do not have the capital to lease a parking space in this building, let alone own our corporate debt. Margaux did not respond to the insult. She simply looked at Abernathy. The old lawyer stepped forward, opened his leather folio, and slid a thick stack of legal documents across the mahogany table. The pages were heavily stamped, notarized, and tabbed with colored flags marking the signature lines. Ms. Sinclair is the sole beneficiary and absolute controller of Aegis Capital, Abernathy stated, his voice cold and precise, a scalpel cutting through the noise of the room. Hollis Belmont transferred all off-book liquid assets to her prior to his death. The transfer was executed through a series of irrevocable trusts that are fully insulated from probate and immune to any challenge under New York estate law. Furthermore, as of 8:45 this morning, we have officially submitted forensic evidence to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the New York County District Attorney's Office. The evidence outlines a 3-year embezzlement scheme orchestrated by Odette Belmont and Thatcher Belmont, in which approximately $97 million in corporate assets were diverted to personal accounts and offshore vehicles. Thatcher jumped out of his chair for the second time. He kicked it sideways, and it crashed into the credenza behind him. You are bluffing. You do not have any proof of anything. This is a shakedown. I am calling our attorneys right now. You should call them, Margaux said. She turned to face him directly. You will need them, but not for the embezzlement. She paused. The room was completely still except for the hum of the building's ventilation system and the faint, distant sound of traffic 52 floors below. I also submitted the Johns Hopkins toxicology reports to the FBI this morning, Margaux said. Her voice dropped, not to a whisper, but to the quiet, precise tone she had used thousands of times in the emergency room when telling a family that their loved one had not survived. The digitalis, Odette. 23 blood samples collected over 14 months, each one showing a consistent subtherapeutic concentration of a cardiac glycoside that had no medical justification in my father's treatment protocol. You administered it through his compounded medications. You altered his prescriptions. You poisoned him slowly enough that his decline looked natural, and you used that decline to strip him of his authority and rewrite his will while he was too impaired to resist. Odette's face changed. For a fraction of a second, the fear was replaced by something harder. The calculating intelligence that had kept her one step ahead of every adversary for 20 years reasserted itself. She sat up straighter in the leather chair. Her voice, when it came, was rough but controlled. This changes nothing about the public will, Odette said. She placed both hands flat on the table, the gesture of a woman who was not yet ready to surrender. The will that was read in this room 5 weeks ago allocated 60% of Belmont Global to me. Even if you own the debt through Aegis Capital, even if you can foreclose on the corporate assets, my 60% stake is a personal asset protected by the terms of the testamentary instrument. You cannot seize it without a separate legal proceeding. You would have to buy me out at fair market value, and I will not sell. I will tie this up in litigation for a decade, if I have to. It was a Hail Mary, thrown with the precision of a woman who had spent 2 decades navigating legal structures designed to protect wealth at all costs. And in any other circumstance, it might have worked. The distinction between corporate debt and personal equity was a legitimate legal barrier, the kind of procedural wall that could take years of litigation to breach. Margaux had anticipated it. The boardroom door opened for the 3rd time. Nolan Kirshner walked in. He was carrying a laptop which he placed on the mahogany table and opened to a screen displaying a dense matrix of financial transactions, each one highlighted in red with corresponding dates, amounts, and destination accounts. Thatcher saw him and froze. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Nolan? His voice cracked on the second syllable. You work for us. What the hell are you doing? I work for your father, Kirshner said. His tone was flat, measured, the voice of a man who had been carrying a secret for 4 years and had just set it down. I have always worked for your father. He placed me inside this company to document exactly what you and your mother were doing to it. Every transaction on this screen is supported by original source documents, server logs, and authenticated metadata. The FBI police received the complete package 40 minutes ago. Thatcher lunged toward the door. Two private security contractors, each one built like a piece of industrial equipment in a dark suit, stepped into the doorway and filled it completely. They did not touch him. They did not speak. Their physical presence was the entire conversation. Odette had not taken her eyes off Kirshner. She was recalculating. Margaux could see it happening in real time, the rapid, desperate computation of a mind searching for an exit in a room where every door had just been locked. The revised will, Margaux said, is void. Odette's eyes snapped to her. My father signed that amendment 6 months before his death. Margaux continued, during the period of most acute cognitive impairment caused by the digitalis you were administering. I have a video recording of my father, made 14 months before his death, while he was in full possession of his faculties, in which he states his true testamentary intentions before an independent Massachusetts attorney and a licensed notary public. He explicitly identifies the amendment as a document he was coerced into signing while chemically impaired. Under New York Estates, Powers and Trusts law, a testamentary instrument executed under undue influence, or during a documented period of cognitive impairment, is subject to invalidation. She let the legal language settle over the room. When the amended will is voided, the original will takes effect. The one my father wrote 4 years ago. Before the poisoning. Before the embezzlement. Before you decided that murdering your husband was a viable business strategy. In that original will, I was allocated 40% of the publicly held company. You received 40%. 20% went to a charitable trust is in my father's name, a trust you eliminated in the revision, because, even dead, my mother's name on a legal document was a threat to you. Odette's face changed for the final time. The calculation stopped. The intelligence behind her eyes did not flicker. It went dark like a screen powering down. What replaced it was not grief, not rage, not even fear. It was the hollow, bottomless recognition of a woman who had just realized that the man she had spent a decade destroying had been smarter than her the entire time. And that every move she had made, every document she had forged, or every milligram of digitalis she had measured into his medications had to been anticipated, documented, and turned into the instrument of her own annihilation. Hollis had not lost. He had let her believe she was winning while he built a machine designed to crush her, and he had handed the ignition key to the one person she had dismissed as irrelevant. The FBI is currently executing search warrants at your Upper East Side penthouse, Margaux said. Interpol has frozen your accounts in the Caymans, in Zurich, and in Jersey. The assets you thought were hidden are not hidden. Kirshner documented every transfer. She reached into her jacket pocket. Her fingers closed around the 1922 peace dollar. She drew it out and placed it on the mahogany table directly in front of Odette's trembling hands. The metallic clink echoed in the silent room like a bell. You are going to need a good criminal defense attorney, Margaux said. They usually require a retainer to begin representation. This should get you started. Lizette had stopped crying. She was standing by the window, very still, staring at the cityscape below, with the expression of someone who had just watched a building collapse and was trying to determine whether they were inside it or outside it. She had not spoken since the doors opened. She had not moved, but as Margaux's words filled the room, as the scale of the devastation became clear, Lizette slowly turned from the window and looked at her half-sister. There was no hostility in the look, no calculation. For the first time in the years Margaux had known her, Lizette Belmont looked exactly like what she was. A woman in her late 20s who had been raised by a predator, given everything she wanted and nothing she needed, and was now standing in the wreckage of a life that had never been built on anything solid. She did not say a word. She simply picked up her handbag from the chair, walked past the security contractors without looking at them, and disappeared into the elevator. Margaux watched her go. She felt nothing for Lizette, not hatred, not pity, just the flat recognition that some people are destroyed not by what they do, but by what they allow to be done in their name. Lizette had never stolen $1. She had never measured digitalis into a compounded prescription. but she had sat in rooms where the theft was discussed and said nothing. She had watched her mother's influence grow and her stepfather's health decline and asked no questions. Silence in the Belmont family had been its own kind of complicity. Odette had not moved from the leather chair. Her hands were in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the tarnished silver coin sitting on the mahogany table in front of her. The morning light from the windows caught the surface of the coin and threw a small, bright reflection onto the ceiling, a single point of silver light spinning slowly in the still air of the boardroom. She reached out and picked up the coin. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling the weight, the ridged edge, the worn relief of Lady Liberty. She pressed her thumb against the eagle's eye, but nothing happened. The mechanism had been sealed. The coin was solid now. Whole. There was nothing left inside it to find. Odette set the coin down gently and folded her hands in her lap. She did not speak. She did not look up when the security contractor stepped forward and informed her that federal agents were waiting in the lobby. She simply stood, smoothed the front of her wrinkled Chanel jacket with both hands, and walked out of the boardroom under escort, leaving the coin on the table. Margaux picked it up. She slipped it back into her pocket. Then she turned, walked through the heavy oak doors, and stepped into the elevator. Abernathy pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. Through the glass walls of the elevator as it began its descent, Margaux could see the sprawling skyline of Manhattan stretching to the horizon. The skyscrapers, the cranes, the distant gray ribbon of the Hudson River. A city that consumed people who were not strong enough to survive it and elevated those who were. She had a multi-billion-dollar logistics network to dismantle. 12,000 employees whose pensions and benefits needed to be protected during the transition. A criminal investigation that would take months, possibly years, to wind through the federal court system. And a decision to make about what kind of person she was going to become now that she had the power to become almost anything. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel victorious. She felt the way she felt after the hardest shifts at Bellevue. The 12-hour nights when she lost patience and saved others and walked out into the morning light too exhausted to cry, carrying the weight of every decision she had made and every decision she had not been fast enough to make. Clear, empty, ready to begin again. When she got back to the hotel suite, Margaux sat alone for a long time. The city hummed around her. The afternoon light shifted across the carpet in slow golden rectangles. She opened the laptop on the desk and inserted the USB drive from the third safe. There was one video file she had not watched. It was labeled with a single word, her name. She pressed play. Hollis Belmont appeared on the screen. But this recording was different from the strategic briefing she had watched in the bunker 5 weeks ago. He was sitting in a different room, one with wooden walls and a window behind him showing dense pine trees. He was in the Haven, and he was not wearing the expression of a man executing a plan. He looked tired. He looked old. He looked like a father. "Margaux," he said. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it, roughened by whatever the Digitalist was doing to his body, but carrying a gentleness that did not belong to the ruthless tycoon the world had known. "This is not about the money. This is not about the company. I have recorded this because I need you to know something that I could never say to your face, because saying it to your face would have put you in danger, and protecting you was more important than letting you know you were loved." He paused. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. His eyes were wet. "The last time I saw you was 8 months ago. You did not see me. I went to Bellevue. I sat in the emergency room waiting area for 3 hours. I told the triage nurse I had chest pain, which was not entirely untrue, and they put me in a curtain bay and forgot about me, which was exactly what I wanted. From behind the curtain, I could see the trauma bay." He stopped again. When he continued, his voice was thicker. "A man came in. Cardiac arrest. They had been working on him in the ambulance. When they brought him through the doors, the team was frantic. I could see it in their faces. They thought they had lost him. And then you walked in. You walked into that room and you put your hands on his chest and you said something to the team. I could not hear the words, but I could see the effect. Everyone stopped panicking. Everyone looked at you. And you said something else. and they started working again. And 8 minutes later, that man had a pulse. Hollis leaned closer to the camera. I sat behind that curtain and I wept. Not because I was dying, not because of what Odette was doing to me. I wept because I realized that you did not need me. You did not need my money. You did not need my name. You had built something with your life that was more valuable than anything I ever built with mine. You save people, Margaux. You walk into rooms where people are dying and you bring them back. I built a logistics company. You build second chances. His breathing was labored now. The recording had been made close to the end. I am giving you the money because the world is not fair, and fairness needs funding. I am giving you the evidence because justice does not enforce itself. But I am not giving you your identity. You already have one. You are an emergency room nurse. You chose that. And it is the single most important thing any Belmont has ever done. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. For a moment, he looked directly into the camera, and Margaux saw her own eyes looking back at her. That same piercing, icy blue, the color of glacial melt, the color of clarity. I love you, Margaux. I have loved you every single day since the moment you were born. The silence was the hardest thing I ever did. Harder than building the company, harder than fighting Odette, harder than dying. I chose to let you think I did not care, because if Odette believed I loved you, she would have destroyed you the way she destroyed me. Your estrangement was your armor, but it was my wound and I carried it every day. He reached toward the camera as though he could touch her through the screen. Use the money to heal. That is what you do. That is who you are. But first, come back to the Haven. Finish what I started there. Not the vaults. Not the security systems. The house itself. Make it into something that would have made your mother proud. The screen went black. Margaux sat in the hotel room and let the tears come. She did not fight them. She did not try to maintain the composure that had carried her through the boardroom, through the courthouse, through every confrontation and negotiation and moment of controlled fury that had defined in the last 5 weeks of her life. She let the grief pour through her, not the sharp, humiliated grief of the will reading, but something deeper, older, and strangely clean. The grief of a daughter who had finally heard her father's voice say the words she had spent 10 years believing she would never hear. She cried for 5 minutes. Then she washed her face, closed the laptop, and picked up the phone. If this story has meant something to you, if it has reminded you of someone you love, or someone you have lost, or someone you wish you could talk to one more time, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what Margaux Sinclair does next with her father's legacy is the part of this story that matters most. The days between the boardroom and the indictment were not quiet. Margaux had expected a clean aftermath. She had been wrong. Within 48 hours of the boardroom confrontation, Odette's remaining legal team, the attorneys who had not yet resigned or been subpoenaed, filed a flurry of emergency motions. They challenged the validity of the Aegis capital debt instruments. They challenged the chain of custody of the toxicology evidence. They filed a motion to compel Margaux to submit to a psychological evaluation, a recycled version of the competency play that had already failed in front of Pemberton. Each motion was defeated within days, but each one required a response, a filing, a court appearance, a decision. Abernathy handled the legal mechanics with the grim efficiency of a man who had spent 4 decades in litigation and understood that the final stages of a fight were often the messiest. But the strategic decisions fell to Margaux. The hardest decision came on the 3rd day. The federal prosecutors assigned to the case wanted Margaux to agree to a plea negotiation framework for Thatcher. They believed that Thatcher's testimony against Odette was essential to secure the murder charge, and that without it, the embezzlement case would succeed, but the poisoning case would be harder to prove beyond reasonable doubt. The digitalis evidence was strong, but a defense attorney could argue that Hollis had been self-administering the medication, that Dr. Pratt's methodology was flawed, that the chain of custody had been compromised. Margaux understood the calculation. She had made similar calculations in the emergency room. Triage decisions where the optimal outcome required accepting a lesser harm to prevent a greater one. Thatcher was guilty. He had participated in the embezzlement. He had known about the poisoning, perhaps even assisted with it. Letting him plead to a reduced charge in exchange for testimony against his mother was not justice. It was strategy. She agreed. Thatcher would plead guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud. He would serve 8 years. And in exchange, he would testify in detail about Odette's role in the poisoning, providing the first-hand corroboration that would seal the murder charge. It was the right decision. It did not feel like the right decision. It felt like the kind of compromise that her father would have made. Cold, pragmatic, effective. She was becoming more like him every day, and she was not entirely sure how she felt about that. On the 5th day after the boardroom, Margaux received a phone call from a number she did not recognize. She answered it on the encrypted phone, cautiously. "Miss Sinclair, this is Dr. Winslow Pratt." Margaux sat down. "I understand that the FBI has publicly identified Odette Belmont as the source of the pressure campaign against my hospital," Pratt said. His voice was formal, but carried an undertone of something that sounded like relief. "I understand that the institutional threat has been neutralized." "It has," Margaux said. "Then I would like to resubmit my findings. I have prepared a sworn affidavit confirming the original toxicology results in their entirety. I will also make myself available as an expert witness if the case proceeds to trial." Margaux closed her eyes. 3 weeks earlier, this man's withdrawal had nearly collapsed the entire evidentiary foundation of the case. She had rebuilt it without him, painstakingly, through sheer force of clinical knowledge and 12-hour days in the bunker of the Haven. And now he was calling to offer what she had already replaced. She could have been angry. She could have told him that his courage had arrived conveniently late. She could have reminded him that the moment of greatest risk was the moment when his testimony had been most needed. And he had chosen his career over the truth. But Margaux was a nurse. She'd spent a decade watching people make decisions under pressure that they later regretted. Decisions driven by fear, by exhaustion, by the desperate human need to protect what they had built. She had watched patients refuse treatment because they were afraid, and she had watched them come back weeks later, humbled and ready. Judgment was not her job. Care was her job. "Thank you, Dr. Pratt," she said. "We will include your affidavit in the evidentiary package." She hung up. Then she called Abernathy and told him to add Pratt's name to the witness list. The case was airtight now. Every seam sealed, every redundancy in place, every vulnerability addressed. Hollis Belmont's final architecture was complete, and the woman he had trusted to build it had built it stronger than even he had imagined. 6 months later, the federal investigation into Odette and Thatcher Belmont concluded with a 37-count indictment. The charges included wire fraud, securities fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, and murder in the second degree. The murder charge was based on the digitalis evidence, corroborated by 3 independent toxicologists who reviewed Margaux's pharmacological analysis and the original notarized reports from the Haven's second vault. Dr. Winslow Pratt, freed from the threat of institutional retaliation once the FBI publicly identified Odette as the source of the pressure campaign against Johns Hopkins, voluntarily submitted a sworn affidavit confirming his original findings. Odette Belmont was arrested at a private airfield in Teterboro, New Jersey, attempting to board a chartered flight to Lisbon. She was denied bail on grounds of flight risk and remanded to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn to await trial. Her personal assets, including the Upper East Side penthouse, the Lake Como villa, and every piece of jewelry she owned, were seized by federal marshals as part of a forfeiture order. Thatcher Belmont was arrested at his apartment in Tribeca. He offered no resistance. According to the arresting agents, he was sitting on the floor of his living room in his bathrobe, surrounded by empty bottles, staring at a wall. He was charged as a co-conspirator in the embezzlement and, after a 4-month negotiation, pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud in exchange for testimony against his mother. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Lizette Belmont was not charged with any crime. The investigation found no evidence that she had participated in the embezzlement or the poisoning. But the assets she had inherited under the revised will, the art collection, the cash trusts, the properties, were voided along with the amended will itself. left with nothing except a studio apartment in Hoboken that she rented with the proceeds from selling her jewelry collection. She did not contest the outcome. She did not contact Margaux. She disappeared from public life entirely. Judge Aldrich Pemberton resigned from the bench 3 days after the competency hearing. A formal investigation by the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct resulted in his disbarment. He was subsequently indicted on federal bribery charges and pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 22 months in a minimum security facility. Nolan Kirshner resigned from Belmont Global Logistics the day after the boardroom confrontation. He declined any compensation or recognition for his role. He told Abernathy that Hollis had paid him well for 4 years and that the work was its own reward. He took a position as CFO of a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Ohio and was never heard from again by the Belmont family. Soren Abernathy retired from active legal practice 6 months after the indictment. He transferred his remaining clients to junior partners at the firm and moved to a house on Cape Cod. He and Margaux spoke on the phone every Sunday evening, a tradition that neither of them had formally agreed to, but that neither of them ever missed. Margaux dismantled Belmont Global Logistics over the course of a year. She did not sell it to a competitor. She did not take it public under new management. She broke it apart methodically, division by division, ensuring that every employee received their full pension, their accrued benefits, and a severance package funded by the liquid assets from the Haven's vault. 12,000 people kept their retirement. 12,000 families did not lose their future because of what Odette and Thatcher had done. It cost her a significant portion of the $2.8 billion. She did not care. The money had never been the point. On a morning in late May, 7 months after the will reading, Margaux drove north from Manhattan for the last time. She took the Taconic State Parkway, then turned onto the dirt logging road that wound up into the Berkshire Mountains. The road was dry now, packed hard by the spring sun, and the forest on either side was dense with new growth. Dogwood and wild azalea bloomed in the understory, and the air that came through the open window smelled of warm earth and pine resin. The iron gates of the Haven stood open. The dead ivy had been cleared from the bars, and the wrought iron had been sanded and repainted in a deep, lustrous black. The rusted bronze nameplate on the stone pillar had been cleaned and re-lettered, but the name on it had changed. Belmont Community Health Center. Margaux pulled into the clearing and parked on the gravel drive. The limestone mansion looked different in the May sunlight. The oxidized copper turrets still pierced the sky, but the windows were open now, and white curtains moved gently in the mountain breeze. The sweeping marble staircase had been pressure-washed and repaired. The oak double doors stood open. Inside, the transformation was complete. The grand foyer had been converted into a reception area, with comfortable seating and warm overhead lighting. The library, with its thousands of first editions still behind glass, now served as a waiting room. The rooms that had once contained covered furniture and heavy velvet drapes had been refitted as examination rooms. A small pharmacy, a dental suite, and a counseling office. The subterranean bunker had been sealed permanently. The gold, the bearer bonds, the diamonds, all of it had been liquidated and dispersed into the foundation. Margaux had created to fund the clinic, a charitable trust named for her mother. The vault was empty now, just a room of reinforced concrete and LED lights, locked behind a steel door that would never be opened again. Fennel Wick was sitting on the top step of the marble staircase when Margaux walked up. He was drinking coffee from a thermos, his scarred hands wrapped around the steel cup, his white hair bright in the morning sun. He had supervised the renovation himself, managing the contractors, rebuilding the mechanical systems, restoring the plumbing and the heating, and the electrical infrastructure that he had maintained for 2 decades. He looked up at Margaux and nodded. "Plumbing is done," he said. "Hot water in every exam room. Furnaces inspected. I replaced the gaskets on the main valve. Should hold through next winter without any trouble." "Thank you, Fennel," he grunted and took a sip of his coffee. He looked out over the clearing at the weeping willows and the forest and the mountains beyond. He would have liked this, Fennel said quietly. He did not say who. He did not need to. Margaux sat down beside him on the step. She was wearing scrubs, not the worn, exhausted scrubs of a Bellevue nurse, coming off a 14-hour shift, but clean, pressed scrubs with the clinic's name embroidered on the chest pocket. She had hired 3 doctors, 2 nurse practitioners, a dentist, and a small administrative staff. The nearest hospital to this part of the Berkshires was 2 hours away. The people in these mountain communities had been driving that distance for generations, past the point of exhaustion, past the point of safety, because there was simply no other option. Now there was. Margaux reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out the 1922 piece dollar. She held it in her open palm. The tarnished silver caught the morning light. Lady Liberty looked up at the sky. The eagle on the reverse stared outward with that fierce, unflinching gaze. She turned the coin over once, feeling the ridged edge against her fingertips. The microscopic seam was still there. If you knew where to feel for it, that tiny line where the 2 halves had been machined apart and fitted back together so precisely that no one would ever know it had been hollow unless they pressed the eagle's eye. She stood up and walked through the open double doors of the clinic into the reception area where the first patients of the morning were beginning to arrive. An elderly man in a flannel shirt and work boots was sitting in the library waiting room, turning his cap nervously in his hands. A woman in her 40s with a persistent cough had signed in at the front desk and was filling out intake paperwork. A teenager had been brought in by his grandmother for a sports physical required by the local high school. Margaux placed the piece dollar on the windowsill of the reception area in a spot where the afternoon sun would catch it every day. She set it down gently, and the soft clink of metal against painted wood was the quietest sound she had ever made in a room. She looked at it for a moment, the coin that had been an insult, then a key, then a weapon, and now, resting on the sill of a clinic that would serve this community for as long as the mountain stood, it was what it had always been meant to be. A reminder of the value of hard work. Margaux turned away from the window, walked to the first examination room, and opened the door. "Good morning," she said to the elderly man in the flannel shirt, who looked up at her with the cautious, grateful expression of someone who had driven too far for too long to see a doctor and could not quite believe that the drive was finally over. "I am Margaux. I will be taking care of you today. Come on in and tell me what is going on." The man stood up slowly, tucked his cap under his arm, and followed her through the door. Outside, the May sun climbed over the Berkshire Mountains and poured through the windows of the haven, warming the coin on the sill, sliding up the reception area, and falling across the threshold of a house that had been built in darkness and had finally, after everything, been opened to the light.